Hey guys, tonight we're going on a journey, not through the bustling streets of a modern city, but across the silent, sprawling landscapes of history's most immense land empire. You're drifting now not on a cloud, but across endless, windswept plains, feeling the vastness stretch out before you, the horizon an almost impossibly distant line. Imagine the sun dipping below that distant curve, painting the sky in sleepy hues of orange and purple, and you're just there, alone, in the middle of nowhere, with nowhere to go but everywhere. This journey, however, isn't just about pretty sunsets. It's about a logistical puzzle so mind-bogglingly immense, so deeply challenging, that if you were tasked with governing it, you'd probably just pack a very large suitcase of snacks and spend the rest of your life trying to find a decent Wi-Fi signal. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You stand at the edge of the known world, or at least, what was the known world to many during the 13th century. You gaze out, and the horizon stretches so far it seems to curve, not just with the gentle arc of the earth, but with the sheer, overwhelming scale of human ambition. This isn't just a big country. It's a collection of countries, cultures, climates, and continents, all theoretically under one banner. You try to wrap your mind around it. An empire so vast that if you stood at one end, the message you sent to the other might arrive generations later, perhaps delivered by your great-grandchild's great-grandchild, who'd probably just shrug and say, "Yeah, heard that already." Picture yourself as a medieval administrator, perhaps a very tired one, tasked with the impossible. You sit in the capital, let's say Karakoram, a place that, despite its later grandeur, still felt like a dot on an endless map. You need to send an order, a decree, a simple "hello, how are things?" to a governor thousands of miles away, perhaps near the Caspian Sea, or even further, deep into what we now call Eastern Europe. You don't have email. You don't have WhatsApp. You don't even have a reliable pigeon service, because frankly, those birds would likely stage a union protest about the mileage. The challenge isn't just distance. It's everything that comes with distance. You imagine the messenger, a solitary figure, setting off into the vastness. They ride for days, weeks, months. They traverse scorching deserts where the sand whispers forgotten names, and icy steppes where the wind bites like a hungry wolf. They cross mighty rivers, scale formidable mountain ranges. Every step, every hoofbeat, is a battle against the elements, against fatigue, against the sheer, soul-crushing isolation. You think about your last long car trip and how you complained about the lack of decent coffee shops. Imagine this, but for months, and the only rest stop is a patch of grass. Consider the sheer diversity of the terrain. You start in the heartland of Mongolia, with its rolling grasslands. Then you might hit the forbidding Gobi Desert, where mirages play tricks on the eyes and the sun beats down relentlessly. From there, perhaps into the lush, fertile plains of China, or across the vast Siberian taiga, where dense forests hide secrets and the ground is often frozen solid. Then perhaps the journey continues west, through the rugged mountains of Central Asia, across the vast Caspian steppe, and finally into the more temperate climes of Eastern Europe, reaching places like modern-day Hungary or Poland. Historians still argue whether the Mongol Empire, at its absolute peak, truly extended its direct administrative control all the way to the Adriatic Sea, or if those were more like temporary raiding zones. But even considering its more conservative boundaries, you're talking about an empire that, at its height, was the largest contiguous land empire in history, stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the borders of Central Europe. That's roughly 9 to 11 million square miles, or about 16% of the Earth's land area. To put that into perspective, you could fit the entire United States into it more than 2.5 times. Or, if you prefer, it's roughly the size of the moon. Just imagine trying to govern the moon with a horse and buggy. And it's not just the land itself. Think about the people. You're not just governing one culture, one language, one set of customs. Oh no, you're dealing with dozens, hundreds of distinct groups, nomadic tribes, settled farmers, sophisticated city dwellers, Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, animists. Each with their own traditions, their own grievances, their own way of doing things. You send out a standard imperial decree, written in Mongolian, and hope that somewhere, somehow, someone can translate it into Persian, then into Arabic, then into some local dialect, all without losing the original meaning. It's like trying to run a global corporation where every single employee speaks a different language and you have no translation software. You'd need a very patient HR department. The scale of the problem is truly mind-boggling. How do you collect taxes from people you've never seen, living in places you can barely point to on a map? How do you enforce laws? How do you quell rebellions that might break out thousands of miles away before they fester and spread? How do you even know a rebellion is happening? By the time news of unrest reached the capital, the rebellion might have already crowned its own emperor, built a small theme park, and started issuing commemorative coins. You might send out a scout, a general, an emissary. They leave, and you simply wait. For months. For a year. You have no idea if they made it, if they were ambushed, if they simply decided to retire and open a small yak cheese stand somewhere in the Himalayas. The silence is deafening. Imagine trying to manage a modern business where every email takes 6 months to deliver, and half of them never arrive. You'd be out of business faster than you can say logistical nightmare. This vastness wasn't just a geographical challenge. It was a challenge to the very concept of centralized power. How could a single Khagan, no matter how brilliant or fearsome, truly govern such an immense domain? His voice, carried only by the wind and the endurance of his messengers, would become a whisper by the time it reached the distant provinces. Decisions needed to be made, but information was slow, often outdated by the time it arrived, and sometimes completely inaccurate. It was like trying to play a global game of chess, but your opponent's moves are relayed to you via carrier pigeon, and the pigeon occasionally stops for a nap or gets distracted by a particularly shiny berry. The sheer physical effort required to move information, goods, and people across this colossal expanse meant that effective governance seemed almost impossible. Every journey was an epic undertaking, a saga in itself. And yet, this empire, for a time, did hold together. It did manage to issue decrees, collect tribute, and even coordinate military campaigns across thousands of miles. The very idea that such a thing was even attempted, let alone achieved with any degree of success, is a testament to an ingenuity that often goes unsung. It's a reminder that sometimes the most revolutionary solutions aren't found in grand declarations or flashy displays of power, but in the quiet, persistent, and surprisingly efficient management of the mundane. The question wasn't if the empire was big, it was how they ever managed to keep it from simply dissolving into a million tiny, unconnected pieces, like a very large, very crumbly cookie. You lie there, perhaps the soft hum of your own breathing a gentle counterpoint to the quiet unfolding of history, and you begin to really feel the vastness we spoke of earlier. Not just conceptually, like seeing a map, but truly deeply. Imagine for a moment the man at the very heart of this immense sprawl, Genghis Khan. Not the thunderous conqueror, astride a charging steed, but a different Genghis. Picture him in the quiet hours, perhaps after the dust of a long campaign has settled, or as the last embers of a campfire glow softly under a sky so densely packed with stars it looks like spilled glitter on velvet. He's not thinking of battles now, not of strategy in the conventional sense. He's thinking about connection, about how to hold together this colossal, almost unbelievable domain that stretches further than any empire before it. You can almost hear the soft rustle of the steppe wind outside his tent, a sound that carries far, but not far enough to bridge the chasm between his capital and the distant, newly conquered lands. He's looking at a problem that would make even the most seasoned modern CEO, with all their fiber optics and satellite networks, break out in a cold sweat. How do you govern a territory where it takes months, sometimes even a year, for a message to travel from one edge to the other? It's like trying to run a global corporation by shouting really, really loudly and hoping someone on the other side of the planet eventually hears you. Or, more accurately, like trying to manage a vast multinational enterprise using only carrier pigeons, and half of them get distracted by a particularly shiny beetle mid-flight. The sheer logistical nightmare of it all. In these moments of quiet reflection, you can envision Genghis Khan, his mind, sharp as a honed blade, turning over the fundamental challenge of empire, information. How do you know what's happening in a far-off province if news takes forever to arrive? How do you issue an order that isn't already obsolete by the time it reaches its destination? It's a bit like sending an urgent email about tomorrow's meeting, only to have it arrive 3 weeks later, by which point everyone has already moved on to the next big thing. The very fabric of his burgeoning domain, he knew, depended on a faster pulse. He would have observed the existing, rudimentary methods. Local messengers, perhaps. Riders who pushed their horses to exhaustion, only to collapse themselves, their message still days away from its destination. He would have seen the limitations, the delays, the sheer inefficiency. He understood that while armies could conquer lands, it was information that would truly govern them. Without it, his empire would be less a unified entity and more a collection of disconnected islands, drifting apart in the vast ocean of the steppe. This wasn't just about military dispatches. It was about trade routes, about tax collection, about keeping the peace, about knowing when a local chieftain was grumbling too loudly, or when a drought threatened a distant population. It was about the very nervous system of an empire. And so, in these contemplative silences, the concept of the yam began to take shape. It wasn't a sudden, blinding flash of inspiration, perhaps, but a slow, deliberate crystallization of necessity into genius. He wasn't inventing communication, of course, but he was envisioning a system of communication on a scale never before conceived. Imagine him sketching ideas in the dirt with a stick, or perhaps simply seeing the mental blueprint unfold before him. A network, like veins across a body, connecting every vital organ. Stations dotted strategically across the land like tiny vital nodes. Each one a hub, not just for horses, but for information, for supplies, for the very flow of imperial will. He would have pictured the horses, swift, tireless, ready to go at a moment's notice. And the riders, the Yamchi, a dedicated corps, their lives devoted to the relentless pursuit of speed. No longer would a single rider attempt to cross a continent on one weary horse. Instead, it would be a relay. A horse at full gallop, then a fresh horse, then another, a seamless baton pass of speed and urgency. It was the ancient world's equivalent of building a superhighway, complete with rest stops and gas stations, across a continent that had only ever known dirt tracks and animal trails. You can almost hear him thinking, right, so if we can conquer half the world, surely we can figure out how to get a memo from point A to point B without it taking longer than a full season of reality TV. This wasn't just about speed, though that was paramount. It was about reliability, consistency. He understood that a system was only as strong as its weakest link. So the stations would need to be provisioned, secure, and spaced at just the right intervals to maximize efficiency without overburdening the horses. It was a complex logistical puzzle, solved not with computers and algorithms, but with shrewd observation, practical experience, and an unparalleled understanding of his vast domain. He was, in essence, designing the world's first intercontinental broadband network, only instead of fiber optic cables, he was using muscle and hoof. Historians still argue whether Genghis Khan's vision for the yam was a revolutionary invention or a brilliant, large-scale adaptation of earlier, more localized messenger systems that existed in various forms across Asia. Perhaps it was a bit of both. He certainly wasn't the first person to send a message, but he was the first to conceive of a unified, centrally managed, continent-spanning system dedicated to rapid communication. It was the mental leap from a single messenger running an errand to an integrated, high-speed information superhighway that truly set his vision apart. He saw the potential not just for military advantage, but for the very cohesion of his diverse peoples. Imagine the sheer mental fortitude required to conceptualize something so vast, so intricate, from the ground up, in an era devoid of modern mapping, communication tools, or even advanced civil engineering. He was envisioning a network that would knit together disparate cultures and distant geographies, creating a unified sense of empire through quiet connection. It was a testament to his understanding that true power wasn't just in the sword, but in the swift flow of information. He knew that an empire could only truly breathe if its heart could communicate instantly with its furthest extremities. Perhaps he considered the quirky details too. What would the riders eat? How would they be identified? What about security? Would there be a system for tracking messages, a rudimentary manifest? He was thinking about the Mongol equivalent of, have you tried turning it off and on again, for when a message got delayed. This system would need to be robust, adaptable, and almost invisible in its operation, yet profoundly impactful. A whisper that carried the weight of imperial decree across thousands of miles. In the stillness of the night, with only the distant cry of a night bird for company, Genghis Khan was not just dreaming of a faster messenger service. He was dreaming of unity, of control, of a way to ensure that the whispers of dissent in a distant province reached his ears before they became roars of rebellion. He was envisioning the sinews and nerves of his colossal body politic, a system that would allow his vast horizons to feel, for the first time, truly within reach. This quiet, profound conception was the genesis of the Yam, a network that would quietly, efficiently hold the Mongol Empire together. You stand, or perhaps recline comfortably, at the threshold of a truly remarkable transformation. We've touched upon the grand vision, the whisper of an idea in Genghis Khan's mind, but how does an empire, sprawling like a spilled ink pot across the map, actually begin to stitch itself together? It doesn't happen with a grand, ceremonial ribbon-cutting, darling. Oh no! The Yam, this legendary postal system, began not as a meticulously planned corporate rollout, but as a series of desperate, practical, and utterly indispensable responses to immediate problems. Its origins are truly humble, born from the raw, undeniable necessity of keeping a vast, newly conquered world from unraveling at the seams. Imagine, if you will, the early days of the Mongol conquests. Your Genghis, or perhaps one of his brilliant generals, having just swept across a new territory like a particularly efficient dust bunny. You've won the battle, the banners are flying high, and your heart swells with a quiet, satisfied hum. But then, the immediate, chilling reality sets in. How do you tell the cavalry unit 200 miles to your east that the enemy has been routed and they can stand down? How do you inform the supply train 300 miles to your west that you need more arrows, and yesterday? How do you even know if the next province over is still loyal, or if a disgruntled local chieftain is quietly plotting your demise over a cup of fermented mare's milk? You couldn't just tweet about it, could you? No, this wasn't an era of instant messaging, or even carrier pigeons with tiny little scrolls tied to their legs, though that would have been undeniably adorable. The initial answer, as it always is in times of urgent need, was improvisation. You sent a rider. Any rider. The fastest, most trustworthy person you could find, mounted on the swiftest horse available. You'd hand them a rolled parchment, maybe a verbal message, and watch them disappear into the vast, indifferent landscape, praying they'd make it. This was the primordial soup of the Yam. Individual riders, pushing themselves and their mounts to the absolute limit, driven by the sheer, terrifying urgency of imperial communication. It was less a system and more a series of heroic, often solitary dashes. You can almost feel the wind whipping past your ears, the rhythmic thud of hooves on the steppe, the dust motes dancing in the sunlight as you gallop, a tiny, vital cog in a monumental, unfolding drama. But as the empire ballooned, as one conquered territory seamlessly flowed into another, this ad hoc approach simply wasn't sustainable. You couldn't rely on individual heroics for the constant, relentless flow of information required to govern. Imagine trying to run a global corporation with just one very tired intern running messages between departments. It simply wouldn't work. The sheer volume of military intelligence, troop movements, enemy strengths, supply requirements, weather conditions demanded something more robust. And beyond the battlefield, there was the burgeoning administrative burden. Tax collection reports, legal decrees, census information, and the inevitable complaints from disgruntled local officials who probably just wanted more sheep. So, out of this gnawing necessity, the first embryonic forms of the Yam began to emerge. It wasn't a sudden, grand declaration from Genghis Khan, but a gradual, organic evolution. Commanders, recognizing the vital importance of rapid communication, began to designate specific points along key routes where a fresh horse could be found, where a weary rider could briefly rest, or where a message could be passed to a new, fresh. Historians still debate the precise moment when these informal arrangements solidified into the formalized Yam system, some pointing to specific military campaigns where communication failures highlighted the urgent need, others suggesting a more gradual, organic evolution driven by administrative demands. But what's undeniable is that the pragmatic Mongol mind, always attuned to efficiency and adaptation, quickly grasped the revolutionary potential of such a network. They saw that a single rider, no matter how fast, could only cover so much ground before exhaustion set in. But a relay of riders, each covering a segment of the journey, could move a message across vast distances at astonishing speeds day and night. It was the ancient equivalent of a broadband connection, replacing the dial-up modem of individual gallops. And this truly was the revolutionary spark. It turned a series of discrete, high-stakes dashes into a continuous, flowing current. The concept of a dedicated, state-sponsored infrastructure for communication was not entirely new in history. The Persians had their royal road and messengers, the Romans their cursus publicus, but the Mongols took it to an unprecedented scale, driven by the sheer size and dynamic nature of their conquests. Their system was born from the ground up, out of the very real, very dusty needs of conquest and control, rather than being imposed top-down from an established bureaucracy. It was a gritty, practical solution, forged in the crucible of military expansion. One quirky tidbit about these early days is that the initial postal workers weren't necessarily professional couriers in the way we might think of them. Often, they were simply soldiers or local inhabitants pressed into service, whose primary qualification was their ability to ride fast and endure hardship. Imagine being a seasoned warrior, expecting another skirmish, and suddenly you're handed a scroll and told, "Right, off you go, don't stop until you hit Karakoram." Talk about a career change. You can almost hear the grumbling, though probably very quiet grumbling, about the lack of benefits or a proper pension plan for such an arduous new duty. This emerging network, humble in its beginnings, quickly became the pulsing artery of the nascent empire. It was the nervous system that allowed the colossal body of the Mongol state to feel, to react, to coordinate. Without it, the empire would have been a collection of disparate, isolated conquests, prone to rebellion and unable to respond effectively to threats or opportunities. It was the quiet, unseen force that bound together the vast horizons Genghis had envisioned. From a few scattered points where a fresh horse could be found, it began to grow, tentacle-like, across the steppes, deserts, and mountains, laying the groundwork for the most astonishing communication network the world had ever seen. The Yam was no longer just an idea. It was rapidly becoming the undeniable, indispensable lifeblood of the Mongol Empire. As you journey across the boundless, undulating plains, the wind a constant companion whispering tales of endless horizons, you might find yourself lulled by the rhythmic sway of your mount. The vastness of the Mongol Empire, stretching from the forests of Siberia to the Fertile Crescent, from the shores of the Pacific to the steppes of Eastern Europe, was a truly dizzying concept. How, you might wonder, could a single authority, even one as formidable as the Great Khan, possibly exert its will over such an immense expanse? The answer, surprisingly, wasn't found in monumental fortresses or legions of marching soldiers, but in something far more unassuming, a network of quiet, unassuming postal stations. Imagine, if you will, the endless expanse of the steppe, unbroken by any significant landmark for what feels like days. The sun climbs high, then begins its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Your muscles ache from the saddle, your throat is dry, and the only sounds are the thud of hooves and the sigh of the wind. Just as weariness truly begins to settle in, a faint wisp of smoke appears on the horizon, a delicate thread against the vast sky. Then, as you draw closer, the distinct, earthy scent of horses and wood smoke reaches you, a smell that, to a weary traveler, was surely more comforting than any expensive perfume. This, my friend, is your first glimpse of a Yam station. These strategically placed outposts were not grand castles or bustling cities, but rather tranquil oases of rest and exchange, carefully positioned along the vast imperial arteries. Think of them less as high-tech communication hubs, and more like the world's most efficient, low-key roadside diners, but for horses and very important envelopes. You know, the kind of place where the coffee might be a bit rough, but the service is undeniably quick, and they always have fresh gas, or in this case, fresh horses. As you approach, the structures become clearer. Often, they were clusters of sturdy yurts, the traditional felt tents of the nomadic people, perhaps a few more permanent wooden or mud brick buildings in areas where materials were plentiful. Surrounding these dwellings would be large corrals, often teeming with horses, dozens, sometimes hundreds of them, all waiting. These weren't just any horses, they were carefully bred for endurance and speed, the finest equine athletes of their day, ready to gallop across vast distances with minimal fuss. One might even joke that these horses had a better benefits package than most medieval peasants, given their crucial role in the empire's operations. The very design of these stations spoke of their dual purpose, serenity and speed. They were spaced with remarkable precision, typically about 20 to 30 miles apart, which was roughly the distance a horse could gallop at full speed before needing rest or replacement. This careful calibration meant that a rider, pushing hard, could reach the next station within a few hours, change mounts, perhaps grab a quick bite, and be off again with barely a pause. It was the ancient world's version of a pit stop, but instead of changing tires, you were swapping out your entire engine. Stepping inside a Yam station, you would find a quiet hum of activity. Despite the potential for rapid turnover, there was an underlying calm, a sense of purpose that permeated the air. The staff, known as Yamchi or simply station keepers, were often locals, perhaps even families, who lived and worked at the station. They were responsible for maintaining the horses, ensuring a constant supply of fresh mounts, and providing provisions for the riders. You might hear the soft murmur of voices, the gentle clinking of a cooking pot, or the rustle of straw as a horse shifts in its stall. It was a stark contrast to the often harsh realities of travel in the Mongol Empire, a small, warm bubble of civilization in an otherwise wild and untamed landscape. These stations were more than just stables and resting points. They were vital nodes in the empire's vast neural network. They functioned as waypoints for official dispatches, military orders, and imperial decrees, ensuring that the Khan's word could travel with astonishing velocity across his enormous domain. Imagine the sheer relief of a weary messenger, arriving at a station after pushing his horse to its limit, knowing that within minutes he could be on a fresh, rested mount, continuing his urgent journey. It was a logistical marvel, a system that prioritized speed and efficiency above all else, yet managed to maintain an almost monastic calm within its individual components. Mainstream historical fact time. At its peak under Kublai Khan, the Yam Network reportedly encompassed over 10,000 stations across the empire, with hundreds of thousands of horses at their disposal. This was an infrastructure project on a scale unseen before or since, a testament to Mongol organizational genius. And yet, for all its grandiosity, each individual station maintained a remarkable sense of quiet efficiency. It wasn't about flashy displays of power, it was about the smooth, almost silent flow of information and personnel. Now, for a quirky tidbit, while horses were the primary mode of transport, some Yam stations in specific regions also maintained other animals for different terrains. In the arid deserts, you might find camels ready for duty, while in the snowy northern reaches, reindeer or even dog sleds might have been part of the local Yam's inventory. It was a surprisingly adaptive system, demonstrating a deep understanding of local conditions and resourcefulness. It's almost as if they had a pick-your-preferred mode of transport option, truly catering to every traveler's specific needs, assuming your needs involved getting somewhere very fast by animal. And speaking of specific needs, historians still argue whether the Yamchi themselves, the dedicated riders, were permanently stationed at these posts, or if they were primarily messengers carrying their own unique identifying peza, a metal tablet granting imperial authority, who simply swapped horses and occasionally rested there. It's a subtle but important distinction, influencing our understanding of the exact daily life and responsibilities of those who kept the empire connected. Were they more like modern-day postal workers, or more like independent contractors with a very specific, high-stakes delivery route? The debate continues to gently hum in academic circles, much like the low murmur of conversation in a quiet Yam station. These stations weren't just about speed, they were also about security. Each station was a controlled environment, providing a safe haven for travelers and their precious cargo. While the vast steppes could be dangerous, the Yam routes were generally safer, as they were under imperial protection and constantly traversed by official personnel. This quiet security, almost a byproduct of the system's efficiency, made them invaluable. You could almost feel the collective sigh of relief from anyone arriving, knowing they were momentarily safe from bandits or the harsh elements. Imagine the contrast: outside the boundless, often unforgiving wilderness, inside a small, bustling hub of activity, focused entirely on the empire's pulse. Here, a messenger might quickly relay a dispatch from the Khan, requesting fresh horses and a quick meal. Nearby, a local official might be coordinating the collection of taxes, using the Yam Network to send reports back to the provincial capital. Even distant merchants, if they had the proper permissions, could utilize these stations, making their journeys across the empire faster and safer. It was a remarkably democratic system in its quiet utility, serving the highest echelons of power while simultaneously providing a crucial service to anyone authorized to use it. The strategic placement of these stations, their constant readiness, and the quiet dedication of the people who maintained them were the unsung heroes of Mongol administration. They weren't flashy, they didn't win battles, but they provided the essential circulatory system for an empire that otherwise might have collapsed under its own immense weight. They were the silent, steady heartbeat of the Mongol Imperium, ensuring that the whisper of the Khan in Karakoram could become a roar heard thousands of miles away, all thanks to a fresh horse and a warm yurt. Now, with those tranquil oases of the Yam stations gently appearing on your mental map, let's zoom in, or perhaps drift in closer, to the very heartbeat of this sprawling, silent network, the Yamchi. Imagine, if you will, the quiet dedication of these riders, whose lives were quite literally a blur of motion, a ceaseless, almost hypnotic rhythm of hoofbeats carrying the very essence of empire across vast, indifferent landscapes. You find yourself, in this moment, not just observing, but embodying one of them. You are a Yamchi. Your life is defined by the saddle, by the scent of horse sweat and dust, by the relentless, rhythmic sway of a galloping beast beneath you. It's not a glamorous life, mind you. There are no grand parades, no cheering crowds. Your applause comes in the form of a swiftly delivered message, a vital piece of intelligence arriving just in time to avert a crisis, or perhaps merely a notification that the emperor prefers his kumis a little less fermented this week. Ah, the thrilling life of ancient postal service. You might even joke to yourself, if you had the breath, that your job is basically the 13th century equivalent of being perpetually stuck in rush hour, only your vehicle is alive and occasionally tries to buck you off. Your day begins, often before dawn, with the crisp, cool air still holding the lingering chill of night. You pull on your sturdy, practical clothing, perhaps a thick felt coat, designed for endurance, not for fashion. Your most prized possession, beyond your own life, is the Pesa, the imperial tablet. This isn't just a fancy ID badge. It's your golden ticket, or silver, or even iron, depending on your rank and the urgency of your mission. This tablet, often inscribed with the head of a tiger or a falcon, and bearing an inscription in Mongolian that roughly translates to "by the strength of eternal heaven," an edict of the emperor, is your passport. It grants you free passage, the right to demand fresh horses, provisions, and even lodging at any Yam station along your route. It's the ultimate VIP pass, ensuring that you, the humble messenger, are treated with the respect due to an extension of the great Khan's will. Without it, you're just a dusty traveler. With it, you are the swift embodiment of imperial authority. As you approach your first horse of the day, you notice its powerful build, its deep chest, its intelligent eyes. These aren't just any horses. The Mongols were famously horse people. They bred and selected for stamina, speed, and hardiness. You might be riding one of the famed Mongol ponies, small but incredibly strong, capable of covering immense distances with surprising swiftness. Or perhaps, on certain stretches, a slightly larger, faster breed, specifically chosen for the flat, open steppes. You swing yourself into the saddle, a familiar embrace. The leather creaks, the horse shifts, and then, with a light touch of your heels, you are off. The journey begins. You settle into the rhythm, the steady thud-thud-thud of hooves on the dirt track. The wind whips past your ears, carrying the scent of dry grass, distant campfires, or perhaps the faint, earthy smell of a recent rain. Your eyes scan the horizon, not just for the path ahead, but for any sign of trouble, though the Yam routes were generally well-maintained and relatively safe, precisely because they were so vital to the empire. The silence of the vast landscape is broken only by the wind, the horses breathing, and the occasional jingle of your own gear. It's a meditative experience, in a way, if you can ignore the constant jostling and the pressing urgency of your mission. You become one with the horse, a single, focused entity, moving with purpose across an indifferent world. The speed is astonishing for the era. A mainstream historical fact often cited is that the Yam system could allow messages to travel over 200 miles, about 320 kilometers, in a single day, an incredible feat when you consider the terrain and the lack of modern infrastructure. This wasn't one horse, one rider for 200 miles, of course. This was the magic of the relay system. You ride hard, pushing your mount, until you see the telltale signs of a Yam station approaching. Perhaps a wisp of smoke, a cluster of jars, yurts, or a simple, sturdy wooden structure. As you gallop into the station, often without even dismounting fully, the routine kicks in. It's a finely tuned ballet of efficiency. As you slow your lathered horse, another Yamchi is already preparing to take your dispatch. Your message, perhaps a scroll tucked securely in a leather pouch, is swiftly handed over. You might exchange a few terse words, a quick update on conditions, or simply a nod of acknowledgement. Your exhausted horse is led away to be watered and rested, and you too can finally dismount, stretch your aching limbs, and perhaps grab a quick bowl of hot broth or some dried meat. But there's no time for lingering. The next rider, with your message now in hand, is already mounted on a fresh, eager horse, disappearing back into the horizon, carrying the imperial will onward. This constant, almost seamless handover is what made the Yam so incredibly effective. It wasn't about the superhuman endurance of a single rider, though their dedication was certainly impressive. It was about the systemic efficiency, the network effect, long before anyone even conceived of such a term. Think of it as the ultimate ancient relay race, but instead of a baton, they're passing crucial information. It's like the world's first truly efficient express delivery service, except your package is a decree that could decide the fate of nations, and your delivery vehicle runs on oats and sheer equine willpower. The dedication of these Yamchi was legendary. They were often men of the steppes, accustomed to harsh conditions and long hours in the saddle. Their loyalty to the Khan and the empire was paramount. There are even quirky tidbits, perhaps apocryphal, about their extreme discipline, such as the rule that a Yamchi was forbidden from carrying any personal items that might slow him down, or even from stopping to eat a full meal, relying instead on quick, high-energy snacks like dried meat or curd. They were, in essence, human conduits for information, expected to prioritize the message above all else, including their own comfort or even, at times, their safety. You feel the constant urge, the internal clock ticking, urging you onward. There's no out-of-office reply for a Yamchi. Historians still argue whether the Yamchi were always volunteers, conscripted laborers, or a mix of both, but what is clear is that their role was indispensable and highly respected within the Mongol system. They were the silent sinews of power, connecting the brain of the empire, the great Khan and his court, to its farthest limbs. Their swift journeys ensured that decrees from Karakoram or later from Khanbaliq, modern-day Beijing, could reach distant provinces with unheard-of speed, allowing for rapid deployment of troops, collection of taxes, or the dissemination of new laws. You spend your days like this, a blur of motion and fleeting stops. The sun rises, the sun sets, and you are still moving, or resting just long enough to be ready to move again. The stars overhead become your familiar companions, mapping out the vastness of the land you traverse. You learn to sleep quickly, deeply, whenever the opportunity arises, your body attuned to the needs of the journey. The world shrinks and expands around you, shrunk by the relentless pace of your travel, expanded by the sheer, overwhelming scale of the empire you serve. This isn't just about delivering mail. It's about maintaining control, about projecting power, about ensuring that the word of the Khan reverberated across continents, not as a faint echo, but as a clear, immediate command. The Yamchi, with their swift horses and unwavering dedication, were the very embodiment of this ceaseless flow, the vital arteries through which the lifeblood of the Mongol Empire quietly pulsed. As you drift now, picture the vastness of the Mongol Empire not just as a map of conquered lands, but as a living, breathing entity, held together by something far more subtle than steel and horseflesh. You've seen the swift horses, felt the quiet dedication of the Yamchi as they blur past, but it's time to truly appreciate the unseen threads they wove. These weren't just routes for messages, they were the very sinews and nerves of the empire, providing the essential backbone for maintaining order and cohesion within a sprawl so immense it would make modern logistics experts weep into their spreadsheets. Imagine, if you will, being the great Khan, sitting in your grand yurt in Karakoram, a city that, while impressive, still felt like a tiny island in an ocean of land. To your north, Siberian forests whispered secrets. To your west, the plains stretched into Russia. To your south, the fertile fields of China beckoned. And to your east, Korea lay nestled by the sea. How, you might wonder, do you govern such an expanse? How do you ensure that a tax decree issued today is enforced next month in a province thousands of miles away? How do you know if a local chieftain is stirring up trouble, or if a distant border is under threat? Without the Yam, it would have been like trying to manage a global corporation, using only carrier pigeons and smoke signals. Good luck with that quarterly report, am I right? This unseen web of communication was, in essence, the Mongol Empire's nervous system. Just as your own brain relies on instantaneous signals to tell your toes what to do, the Khan's central government needed immediate, reliable information from every single extremity of its vast body. Think of it. A rebellion flares up in a distant province. In most empires of the era, news might take months to trickle back to the capital, by which time the rebellion could have festered, grown, and become an insurmountable problem. But with the Yam, reports of unrest could be galloping towards the Khan within days, sometimes even hours. This meant that orders for suppression, or even diplomatic overtures, could be dispatched with astonishing speed. The Mongol military, already renowned for its swiftness, became even more formidable when guided by real-time intelligence delivered by the Yam. It was the ultimate force multiplier, allowing a relatively small central force to exert disproportionate control over immense distances. This was a mainstream historical fact that awed contemporaries. The ability to receive news from the furthest corners of the empire within weeks, sometimes days, was unprecedented and crucial for coordinating vast military movements and suppressing revolts swiftly. Imagine the look on a rebel leader's face when the Khan's army shows up seemingly out of nowhere, having been alerted to their brewing mischief long before they thought possible. It was like having a spy network that also delivered mail. Beyond military intelligence, the Yam was the conduit for all imperial decrees. Laws, tax regulations, appointments of officials, census data, even detailed reports on weather patterns and crop yields, all flowed along these unseen threads. You might receive a dispatch detailing new trade regulations for the Silk Road one day, and the next, an order to prepare for a winter campaign in a region you didn't even know existed. This constant flow of information allowed the Khan to make informed decisions, to adapt to changing circumstances, and to ensure a degree of uniformity across his diverse territories. Without it, the empire would have fractured into a collection of independent warlord states, each pursuing its own agenda, much like a badly organized potluck where everyone brings potato salad. The psychological impact of the Yam cannot be overstated either. Imagine being a local governor in a remote region, thousands of miles from the Khan's direct gaze. In other empires, you might be tempted to skim a little off the top, perhaps rule with a slightly heavier hand than decreed, knowing that direct oversight was minimal. But with the Yam, you knew that a messenger could arrive at any moment, carrying an imperial edict, or even worse, an inquiry. Your reports, detailing your successes and conveniently omitting your failures, would be whisked away to the capital, and you knew that the Khan, or his trusted advisors, would be reading them. This created a sense of omnipresence, a feeling that the Khan's eyes, though distant, were always watching, always aware. It was the ancient world's version of a boss who always seems to know what you're doing, even when they're on vacation. This silent vigilance, more than any standing army, deterred corruption and rebellion, fostering a quiet adherence to imperial authority. And it wasn't just about control, it was also about cohesion. How do you knit together a tapestry woven from nomadic tribes, sophisticated urban dwellers, forest hunters, and desert traders? The Yam helped bridge these vast cultural and geographical divides. Messages weren't just about governance, they carried news, stories, and even cultural influences. A merchant traveling the Yam might pick up a new idea from Persia and bring it to China, or a Chinese invention might make its way west. The system facilitated a shared imperial identity, even if it was sometimes one imposed from above. It was the original "we're all in this together" campaign, just with more horses and less team-building exercises. Now, for a slightly quirky tidbit, the Yam system wasn't solely dedicated to the grim business of war and governance. Oh no, it also served as a sort of express delivery service for the Khan's personal whims and luxuries. Imagine fresh fish, caught just days ago in a distant lake, arriving at the Khan's landlocked capital, still perfectly edible thanks to the rapid transport. Or rare fruits from the south, exotic birds, or even ice transported from mountain peaks to cool the Khan's drinks in the summer heat. This shows a softer, more luxurious side to its function beyond just iron-fisted control and administrative efficiency. It was like having Amazon Prime for emperors, but with actual horsepower. Despite its undeniable utility, historians still argue whether the Yam's immense cost and logistical demands ultimately weakened the empire by draining resources, or if its efficiency was so paramount that it was an indispensable investment for maintaining control over such a vast and diverse realm. Was it a necessary expense that paid for itself in stability, or a gilded cage that eventually became too heavy to bear? The debate continues to gallop on, much like the Yamchi themselves. So, as you settle deeper into your sleep, consider those unseen threads. They weren't flashy. They didn't win battles on their own. But they ensured that every military campaign was coordinated, every tax collected, every decree enforced. They allowed the Mongol Empire, for a time, to operate with a level of centralized control and responsiveness that was simply unheard of in its era. It was the quiet, persistent hum of communication that truly held the greatest land empire the world had ever seen, silently, efficiently together. Self-correction example: during drafting my first draft might just state, it allowed quick communication. I'd then expand. Quick communication meant news of rebellion reached the Khan in days, not months. This meant orders for suppression could be dispatched before the rebellion fully consolidated. This was unprecedented and gave the Mongols a massive advantage. This kind of elaboration helps meet word count and adds depth. I also need to make sure the unseen aspect is a recurring theme. Silent vigilance, quiet adherence, persistent hum. By following this structured approach, focusing on the specific requirements for each section, and using iterative refinement, I can produce a high-quality, compliant script. Section 6. As you drift now, picture the vastness of the Mongol Empire not just as a map of conquered lands, but as a living, breathing entity, held together by something far more subtle than steel and horseflesh. You've seen the swift horses, felt the quiet dedication of the Yam as they blur past, but it's time to truly appreciate the unseen threads they wove. These weren't just routes for messages, they were the very sinews and nerves of the empire, providing the essential backbone for maintaining order and cohesion within a sprawl so immense it would make modern logistics experts weep into their spreadsheets. Imagine, if you will, being the great Khan, sitting in your grand yurt in Karakoram, a city that, while impressive, still felt like a tiny island in an ocean of land. To your north, Siberian forests whispered secrets. To your west, the plains stretched into Russia. To your south, the fertile fields of China beckoned. And to your east, Korea lay nestled by the sea. How, you might wonder, do you govern such an expanse? How do you ensure that a tax decree issued today is enforced next month in a province thousands of miles away? How do you know if a local chieftain is stirring up trouble, or if a distant border is under threat? Without the Yam, it would have been like trying to manage a global corporation, using only carrier pigeons and smoke signals. Good luck with that quarterly report, am I right? This unseen web of communication was, in essence, the Mongol Empire's nervous system. Just as your own brain relies on instantaneous signals to tell your toes what to do, the Khan's central government needed immediate, reliable information from every single extremity of its vast body. Think of it, a rebellion flares up in a distant province. In most empires of the era, news might take months to trickle back to the capital, by which time the rebellion could have festered, grown, and become an insurmountable problem. But with the Yam, reports of unrest could be galloping towards the Khan within days, sometimes even hours. This meant that orders for suppression, or even diplomatic overtures, could be dispatched with astonishing speed. The Mongol military, already renowned for its swiftness, became even more formidable when guided by real-time intelligence delivered by the Yam. It was the ultimate force multiplier, allowing a relatively small central force to exert disproportionate control over immense distances. This was a mainstream historical fact that awed contemporaries. The ability to receive news from the furthest corners of the empire within weeks, sometimes days, was unprecedented and crucial for coordinating vast military movements and suppressing revolts swiftly. Imagine the look on a rebel leader's face when the Khan's army shows up seemingly out of nowhere, having been alerted to their brewing mischief long before they thought possible. It was like having a spy network that also delivered mail. Beyond military intelligence, the Yam was the conduit for all imperial decrees. Laws, tax regulations, appointments of officials, census data, even detailed reports on weather patterns and crop yields, all flowed along these unseen threads. You might receive a dispatch detailing new trade regulations for the Silk Road one day, and the next, an order to prepare for a winter campaign in a region you didn't even know existed. This constant flow of information allowed the Khan to make informed decisions, to adapt to changing circumstances, and to ensure a degree of uniformity across his diverse territories. Without it, the empire would have fractured into a collection of independent warlord states, each pursuing its own agenda, much like a badly organized potluck where everyone brings potato salad. The psychological impact of the Yam cannot be overstated either. Imagine being a local governor in a remote region, thousands of miles from the Khan's direct gaze. In other empires, you might be tempted to skim a little off the top, perhaps rule with a slightly heavier hand than decreed, knowing that direct oversight was minimal. But with the Yam, you knew that a messenger could arrive at any moment, carrying an imperial edict, or even worse, an inquiry. Your reports, detailing your successes and conveniently omitting your failures, would be whisked away to the capital, and you knew that the Khan, or his trusted advisors, would be reading them. This created a sense of omnipresence, a feeling that the Khan's eyes, though distant, were always watching, always aware. It was the ancient world's version of a boss who always seems to know what you're doing, even when they're on vacation. This silent vigilance, more than any standing army, deterred corruption and rebellion, fostering a quiet adherence to imperial authority. And it wasn't just about control, it was also about cohesion. How do you knit together a tapestry woven from nomadic tribes, sophisticated urban dwellers, forest hunters, and desert traders. The Yam helped bridge these vast cultural and geographical divides. Messages weren't just about governance, they carried news, stories, and even cultural influences. A merchant traveling the Yam might pick up a new idea from Persia and bring it to China, or a Chinese invention might make its way west. The system facilitated a shared imperial identity, even if it was sometimes one imposed from above. It was the original "we're all in this together" campaign, just with more horses and less team-building exercises. Now, for a slightly quirky tidbit, the Yam system wasn't solely dedicated to the grim business of war and governance. Oh no, it also served as a sort of express delivery service for the Khan's personal whims and luxuries. Imagine fresh fish, caught just days ago in a distant lake, arriving at the Khan's landlocked capital, still perfectly edible thanks to the rapid transport. Or rare fruits from the south, exotic birds, or even ice transported from mountain peaks to cool the Khan's drinks in the summer heat. This shows a softer, more luxurious side to its function beyond just iron-fisted control and administrative efficiency. It was like having Amazon Prime for emperors, but with actual horsepower. Despite its undeniable utility, historians still argue whether the Yam's immense cost and logistical demands ultimately weakened the empire by draining resources, or if its efficiency was so paramount that it was an indispensable investment for maintaining control over such a vast and diverse realm. Was it a necessary expense that paid for itself in stability, or a gilded cage that eventually became too heavy to bear? The debate continues to gallop on, much like the Yamchi themselves. So, as you settle deeper into your sleep, consider those unseen threads. They weren't flashy. They didn't win battles on their own. But they ensured that every military campaign was coordinated, every tax collected, every decree enforced. They allowed the Mongol Empire, for a time, to operate with a level of centralized control and responsiveness that was simply unheard of in its era. It was the quiet, persistent hum of communication that truly held the greatest land empire the world had ever seen, silently, efficiently together. Imagine now, as you drift further into this tranquil history, the very essence of what these swift riders carried. It wasn't just physical mail, like your credit card bill or that oddly specific collectible you ordered online. Oh no, this was the lifeblood of an empire, flowing through its veins with a surprising, almost unbelievable velocity. You see the Yamchi, those dedicated souls, not just as simple messengers, but as the living, breathing conduits of imperial power, moving information that could ignite a war or secure a fragile peace. Consider first the whispers of war. As you picture the vast, rolling steppes or the fortified cities of distant lands, you understand that military intelligence was paramount. A general in Persia needed to know the disposition of enemy forces in the Caucasus. A commander on the borders of the Song dynasty needed swift confirmation of reinforcements. These weren't just polite inquiries, they were urgent dispatches, often sealed with wax and bearing the Khan's personal imprimatur, traveling in sturdy, often waterproof, pouches designed to withstand the elements and the rigors of the journey. You can almost hear the thud of hooves on the dirt, the rhythmic creak of leather, as a message about a looming siege or a victorious advance thunders across hundreds of miles. The speed was astonishing. For instance, a message from the far reaches of the empire, say from the front lines in Hungary, could theoretically reach the Great Khan's court in Karakorum in a matter of weeks, sometimes even less, depending on the urgency and the condition of the routes. Try sending a letter cross-country today without express shipping. It might still take a week. Now imagine doing that across half a continent, with no paved roads, no cars, and certainly no satellites. This wasn't just fast for its time, it was blindingly fast. It meant that the Khan, sitting in his yurt, could receive news of a battle fought thousands of miles away with an immediacy that would make any modern general green with envy. It wasn't quite real-time strategy, no, but it was certainly light years ahead of the typical pace of communication in other contemporaneous empires, where news might take months, if it arrived at all, often by rumor and word of mouth. These military dispatches weren't just reports, they were often commands. Imagine the tension as a Yamchi gallops into a camp, dust clinging to his clothes, a scroll clutched tightly. The contents could dictate a change in strategy, order a retreat, or command a decisive charge. The very fabric of Mongol military coordination, which so often baffled their enemies with its seamless synchronization across vast distances, was utterly dependent on the Yam. Without it, the Empire's famed lightning campaigns would have been mere slow-motion fumbles. You can almost hear the sigh of relief from a distant general receiving crucial intelligence, or the groan of frustration from one who just missed a vital dispatch due to some unforeseen delay. It was the original ping that let you know your allies were still online and perhaps about to send you a very important message. But it wasn't all about the clang of steel and the cries of battle. The Yam also carried tidings of peace, diplomatic correspondence that was just as critical, if not more so, for the long-term stability of the empire. Picture ornate scrolls, carefully penned in various languages, carrying messages of alliance, demands for tribute, or even complex negotiations for prisoner exchanges. These documents, often sealed with intricate imperial stamps, traveled with the same urgency as military orders, ensuring that the Khan's will, or his olive branch, reached its intended recipient without undue delay. Consider the delicate dance of diplomacy. A new vassal state might send a message of loyalty, seeking the Khan's protection. A rebellious region might receive a stern warning. Or perhaps a distant European monarch, curious about these strange, powerful people from the East, might dispatch an envoy whose entire journey, and the subsequent return with the Khan's reply, would be facilitated by the Yam. It was the ultimate international postal service, ensuring that even the most polite request for submission, which, let's be honest, the diversity of information flowing through this network was astounding. Beyond military strategy and diplomatic niceties, the Yam carried census data, tax reports from newly conquered territories, updates on local harvests, reports of banditry, news of significant births or deaths within the royal family, and even detailed accounts of the weather conditions across different regions, vital for planning future movements or understanding potential agricultural yields. It was the empire's internal memo system, its early warning network, and its data collection agency, all rolled into one incredibly efficient package. Mainstream historical fact *, the Yam system was instrumental in allowing the Mongol Empire to maintain centralized control over its vast territories, enabling the Great Khan to receive rapid intelligence and issue timely commands, which was a significant factor in their ability to conquer and administer such a massive contiguous landmass. You could think of the Yam as the empire's nervous system, constantly transmitting impulses to and from the central brain. Every bit of information, no matter how mundane it might seem to us today, contributed to the Khan's comprehensive understanding of his domain. He wasn't ruling in a vacuum. He was informed, often surprisingly well, about the day-to-day realities of his far-flung subjects. This constant flow of data allowed for a level of governance that was unprecedented for an empire of its size, enabling decisions to be made with a degree of awareness that other rulers could only dream of. Now for a peculiar, quirky tidbit that highlights the Yam's ingenuity. To denote the urgency or specific nature of a message, writers would sometimes attach feathers of different colors to the dispatch. A black feather might signify extreme urgency, a white feather perhaps a diplomatic message of peace, and so on. It was a visual shorthand, a nonverbal cue that could be understood quickly by station masters and other writers, ensuring that critical mail was prioritized even before the pouch was opened. Imagine the subtle flutter of a black feather, signaling that the fate of an entire army might hang in the balance, or the gentle rustle of a white one, carrying the hope of a new alliance. It was like an early version of email priority flags, only much more aerodynamic and significantly less prone to being ignored. Yet, despite this incredible efficiency, historians still argue whether the sheer volume of information transmitted through the Yam truly allowed for real-time strategic decision-making across the entire empire, or if it was more about maintaining general awareness and long-term planning. Was the Khan truly micromanaging from Karakoram, or was he just getting very good executive summaries? It's a fascinating debate, pondering the limits of even the most advanced communication system in a world without fiber optics. The speed of the Yam, which allowed this diverse flow of information, truly set the Mongol Empire apart. While other empires relied on slower methods, often taking months for messages to travel across their domains, the Mongols had created a system where a message could cover hundreds of miles in a single day, sometimes more. This meant that rebellions could be swiftly identified and crushed, diplomatic overtures could be responded to before opportunities faded, and military campaigns could be coordinated with a precision that left opponents bewildered. You can almost hear the whispered exclamations of amazement from those who encountered it. They knew? Already? How? It was the ultimate competitive advantage in a world where information was power, and the Mongols had a superhighway for it. So, as you slowly drift further into this sleep-inducing history, picture those silent, swift threads of information weaving across continents. From the urgent whispers of war, carried by riders pushing their horses to their limits, to the serene tidings of peace, handled with diplomatic grace, the Yam was the invisible force that held the vast Mongol Empire together. It was the silent hum beneath the thunder of hooves, the constant, reliable pulse of communication that allowed an empire of unparalleled size to function, to grow, and to endure, even if just for a while. Now, as your mind drifts gently further into the quiet history of the Yam, let's expand our view beyond just the urgent dispatches of the imperial court. Because while the Yam was, at its heart, a postal system designed for speed and official communication, its quiet efficiency couldn't help but spill over, becoming a vital artery for so much more. Imagine, if you will, this vast network of stations and riders not just as a high-speed internet for emperors, but as the superhighway of its time, a path that welcomed, or at least tolerated, more than just the official mailbag. You see, the very existence of such a well-maintained, secure, and provisioned route made it an irresistible proposition for others whose journeys were less about military strategy and more about diplomacy, discovery, or even, dare we say, profit. So let's picture the diverse array of individuals who found themselves traversing these very same paths, each contributing in their own way to the quiet hum of connection that the Yam fostered across the sprawling Mongol Empire. First, consider the imperial envoys. These weren't your everyday mail carriers, oh no. These were the official representatives of the great Khan himself, often adorned in fine silks, riding magnificent horses, and carrying not just messages, but the very authority of the empire on their shoulders. You can almost feel the weight of their mission as they gallop through the vast steppes, their destination a distant province, a foreign court, or a newly conquered territory. Their purpose might have been to deliver a stern decree, negotiate a treaty, collect taxes, or simply to report on the state of affairs in a far-flung corner of the realm. The Yam was their indispensable tool, guaranteeing them not just speed, but also security and the ready provision of fresh mounts and sustenance at each station. Think of it, an envoy from Karakoram, the imperial capital, needing to reach the distant reaches of Persia or China. Without the Yam, such a journey would be a perilous, months-long undertaking, fraught with dangers and delays. But with the Yam, they could cover incredible distances, sometimes over 100 miles a day, ensuring that imperial will was projected with unprecedented swiftness. These envoys often carried a pesa, a tablet of authority, typically made of bronze, silver, or even gold, which granted them specific privileges at the Yam stations, including access to horses, food, and lodging. It was essentially their ancient VIP pass, allowing them to bypass any queues or bureaucratic slowdowns. Imagine trying to get that many signatures on a single piece of parchment without the Yam to speed things along. You'd still be waiting for the read receipt to come back, wouldn't you? This system of official travel and communication, driven by the needs of centralized governance, is a mainstream historical fact demonstrating the Yam's crucial role in administrative control and diplomatic outreach. But the Yam wasn't exclusively for those with official business stamped with a golden seal. Its very existence created a ripple effect, making travel safer and more feasible for others. And here's where we introduce the curious travelers. These were the adventurers, the scholars, the intrepid monks, and the occasional wanderer whose motivations were less about imperial decree and more about personal exploration or spiritual enlightenment. Perhaps a Buddhist monk from Tibet seeking knowledge in a distant monastery in China, or a European friar venturing eastward on a mission of diplomacy or conversion. You can almost hear the soft creak of their saddle leather, the quiet contemplation in their eyes as the vast landscapes unfold before them. While they wouldn't have had the same priority as an imperial envoy, the mere presence of the Yam stations, the regular traffic of Yamchi, and the general security that came with a well-patrolled route offered them a lifeline. They could often pay for provisions, or simply benefit from the knowledge that help or shelter was never too far away. It was like a very, very early version of a well-maintained highway rest stop, just without the questionable coffee and endless souvenirs. Of course, unlike today's digital nomad, who just needs Wi-Fi, these ancient adventurers actually had to move their bodies. Shocking, I know. This indirect benefit of the Yam, providing a safer corridor for non-official, yet important, cultural and intellectual exchange, underscores its broader impact. And then we come to the industrious merchants. The lifeblood of any empire, aren't they? While the Yam itself wasn't designed for the bulk transport of goods, You wouldn't have seen caravans of silk bales being galloped across the steppe by Yamchi. It absolutely transformed the environment in which trade operated. The security provided by the Yam routes, patrolled by imperial forces and regularly used by official traffic, significantly reduced the risks of banditry and made long-distance trade far more appealing. Imagine a merchant from Samarkand, laden with precious spices and gems, making his way towards Beijing. He might not be riding a Yam horse, but he knows the path ahead is less likely to harbor brigands because of the constant flow of official Yam riders and envoys. The Yam stations also served as crucial points of intelligence, where merchants could gather information on market conditions, political stability, and even weather patterns further along the route. High-value, low-bulk goods or urgent commercial documents could sometimes even be carried by official Yam couriers for a fee, or with special permission, blurring the lines between private and imperial use. They say money talks, but on the Yam, it mostly galloped, facilitating the movement of capital and crucial information about supply and demand. This quiet encouragement of trade, by making routes safer and information more accessible, allowed trade routes to blossom and ideas to travel, linking diverse peoples and fostering economic prosperity. It's fascinating to consider the subtle yet profound ways this network, originally conceived for communication, became a conduit for so much more. Historians still debate the precise extent to which the Yam was directly accessible to private merchants versus simply providing a safer, more regulated environment for general trade routes that ran alongside or intersected the official postal network. Was it a paid service for all, or primarily a security umbrella under which other forms of travel flourished? Regardless, the consensus is clear. The Yam's existence dramatically improved the conditions for long-distance travel and commerce across the Mongol Empire. This multifaceted utility of the Yam fostered an incredible sense of quiet connection. Imperial envoys carried not just decrees but also cultural influences from one end of the empire to the other. Curious travelers, in their quest for knowledge or spiritual fulfillment, became unwitting conduits of cultural exchange, sharing stories, philosophies, and even technologies. And the merchants, driven by the universal desire for profit, wove an intricate web of economic interdependence, bringing goods, innovations, and diverse peoples into contact. Think of the Yam stations themselves, little microcosms of the empire, where a stern imperial envoy might briefly share a fire with a weary scholar, or a garrulous merchant might swap tales with a quiet Yamchi. These fleeting encounters, these moments of shared space on the vast imperial arteries, slowly but surely knit together the disparate cultures and geographies of the Mongol Empire. It wasn't the loud, dramatic unification of conquest, but a gentle, steady hum of interaction, facilitated by the surprisingly efficient postal system that quietly held it all together. The Yam was more than just a means to send a letter. It was the very circulatory system of an empire, ensuring that not just blood, but ideas, goods, and people flowed freely, connecting distant parts of the body with a quiet, persistent beat. You've glimpsed the path, the unseen threads connecting vast distances. But how, you might wonder, did this silent network sustain itself? How did the horses keep galloping, the riders keep riding, and the stations remain vibrant hubs in the middle of nowhere? This isn't about magic, darling, though sometimes it felt like it. It's about a logistical ballet, a quiet masterpiece of supply chain management that would make modern delivery services blush with envy. Imagine trying to run a FedEx operation across an entire continent without GPS, paved roads, or even reliable weather forecasts. The Mongols did, and they did it with a surprising grace. As you drift closer to the Yam station, a faint scent reaches you, not just the earthy aroma of distant lands, but the very distinct, comforting smell of horse and hay, mingled with the subtle tang of wood smoke and the promise of a warm, if simple, meal. This wasn't just a place to hand off a dispatch. It was a living, breathing organism, constantly replenishing itself. And the lifeblood of this organism? Fresh horses, always, and provisions for the weary Yamchi. Think of it like this. Every single Yam station, strategically placed roughly every 25 to 30 miles, a manageable day's ride for a horse pushing itself, or a quicker sprint for a rider needing urgent speed, was a miniature logistical hub. Each one had to be fully equipped. We're talking stables, often quite large, designed to house dozens of horses. You might picture a grand, ornate stable, but in truth, these were often practical, robust structures, built to withstand the elements and the constant traffic. They were the equine equivalent of a five-star hotel, if your five-star hotel only served oats and had very drafty rooms. The horses themselves were the unsung heroes of this entire operation. These weren't your pampered dressage ponies. These were the hardy, resilient Mongol steeds, often smaller than their European counterparts, but possessing an almost mythical endurance. They could graze on sparse pastures, withstand extreme temperatures, and carry a rider for incredible distances without complaint. A mainstream historical fact here is that the Mongol Empire maintained hundreds, if not thousands, of these stations, and each station typically housed a standing reserve of 20 to 50 horses, sometimes even more at major crossroads. Do the math on that for a moment. Thousands upon thousands of horses, all needing to be fed, watered, and rested, across an empire that stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean. It's a number that would make any modern logistics manager reach for a very strong cup of tea, or perhaps something a little stronger. How did they manage this incredible equine inventory? It was a blend of imperial decree and local responsibility. The surrounding communities were often tasked with contributing horses to the Yam system. This wasn't always a joyful contribution, mind you, but it was a compulsory one, seen as a vital service to the empire. Imagine being a farmer, quietly tending your flock, when suddenly an imperial official arrives, needing 5 of your best horses for the next Yam station. It was a gentle burden, perhaps, in the grand scheme of things, but a burden nonetheless. These horses would be rotated, rested, and then put back into service, ensuring a constant supply of fresh legs for the next leg of the journey. It was a bit like a perpetual relay race, but with 4-legged athletes who never complained about needing Wi-Fi. Beyond the horses, there were the provisions. The Yamchi, those dedicated riders, needed sustenance, and so did their equine partners. Each station was stocked with grain for the horses, often millet or barley, whatever was locally available and plentiful. For the riders, it was typically dried meat, various forms of hardtack or dried bread, and often the ubiquitous kumis, fermented mare's milk. This was a quirky tidbit of the Mongol diet. Kumis wasn't just a drink. It was a potent, nutritious, and surprisingly refreshing staple that kept riders hydrated and energized on long journeys. Imagine slurping down a tangy, slightly alcoholic dairy product after galloping for hours. Not exactly your morning latte, but it got the job done. And perhaps, if you were lucky, a warm bowl of something hearty would be waiting, prepared by the station master or their family. This wasn't exactly Michelin-star dining, but when you've been eating dried jerky for 3 days straight, a hot meal feels like a feast fit for a Khan. The provisioning wasn't left to chance. Local populations, again, played a crucial role. They were often required to supply provisions to the Yam stations within their territory. This could involve contributing grain from their harvests, supplying dried meats, or even providing labor to maintain the stations and care for the horses. It was an ingenious system of decentralized supply, where the empire didn't have to ship food thousands of miles. It simply tapped into the existing agricultural output of its vast domain. Of course, this raises an interesting point. Historians still argue whether this system, while incredibly efficient from the imperial perspective, placed an undue or truly gentle burden on the local populations, particularly during times of famine or hardship. Was it a fair exchange for the security and connectivity the Yam provided, or a subtle form of taxation that sometimes pushed communities to their limits? The truth, as always, probably lies somewhere in the vast steppes of nuance. The system also benefited from a sort of internal economy. Station masters, who were often local officials or trusted individuals, were responsible for overseeing the inventory, managing the horses, and ensuring that provisions were always on hand. They kept records, though perhaps not in the meticulous, spreadsheet-driven way we do today. Their ledgers were likely more about knowing how many horses were fit for service, how much grain was left in the storehouse, and when the next contribution from a local village was due. It was a remarkably self-sustaining ecosystem, designed to operate with minimal direct intervention from the distant capital, once the initial framework was established. Imagine the sheer scale of coordination needed to make this appear effortless. It wasn't effortless for the people doing the work, but from the perspective of a message traveling from Karakoram to Baghdad in record time, it certainly seemed so. A Yamchi would arrive, dismount, perhaps grab a quick bite and a swig of kumis, and within minutes would be on a fresh horse, saddle already secured, ready to thunder off into the distance. There was no waiting for a horse to be found in the pasture, no delay while someone went to fetch grain. Everything was prepared, poised, perpetually ready for the next dispatch, the next rider. This constant state of readiness required foresight and a deep understanding of logistics. It meant knowing the seasonal availability of fodder, anticipating the wear and tear on horses, and having contingency plans for unexpected events, like a sudden blizzard or a local uprising. The quiet hum of activity at each yam station was a testament to this planning. The rhythmic sound of a horse chewing hay, the low murmur of conversation, the clatter of a bucket, all contributing to the seamless flow of information that held an empire together. It's almost like they had an early version of predictive analytics, just without the fancy algorithms. They simply knew from generations of experience on the land what was needed, where it was needed, and when. And that, dear friend, made all the difference. You might be drifting now, perhaps imagining those yam stations as self-sustaining marvels, magically conjuring fresh horses and endless provisions from the ether. Perhaps you picture a vast, silent imperial budget, a bottomless purse funding every oat and every hoof trim. But as your mind gently settles on the vastness of that ancient world, you begin to understand that such a colossal undertaking, connecting an empire stretching from the Pacific to Eastern Europe, couldn't possibly run on imperial fiat alone. Oh no, the yam, in its quiet, efficient majesty, relied on something far more intimate, far more pervasive, the gentle yet persistent contribution of the local populations themselves. Imagine, if you will, the subtle hum of a village nestled in a valley, or a nomadic camp spread across the steppe. Their lives, though seemingly untouched by the grand pronouncements of the great Khan, were woven into the very fabric of the yam. This wasn't some optional charity drive, mind you, where you might donate an old sweater or a can of beans. This was a communal effort, a shared burden that, surprisingly, often felt less like a heavy yoke and more like a quiet, collective responsibility for the greater good. Think of it like a very early, very analog version of community policing, but instead of neighborhood watch signs, you had signs pointing to the nearest fresh horse. The primary contribution, as you might guess, came in the form of horses. Each yam station needed a constant supply of fresh, strong mounts. These weren't typically owned directly by the imperial government. Instead, local communities, whether settled farmers or nomadic herders, were often obligated to provide a certain number of horses to the nearest yam station on a rotating basis. Picture the village elder, perhaps with a sigh that sounds suspiciously like a groan, deciding which horse, hopefully not old Buttercup, who's got a limp, would be serving imperial duty this week. It was a bit like a medieval carpool, but with more neighs and significantly less traffic. Beyond the horses, there was the fodder, the hay, the grain, the fresh water, and the provisions for the yamchi, the riders themselves. These tireless couriers, arriving dusty and weary, needed food, drink, and a place to rest their heads, even if only for a few hours. Local families near the stations often bore the brunt of this hospitality, providing meals and lodging. This wasn't always a glamorous task. Imagine running a bed and breakfast where your guests arrive at 3 a.m., covered in road dust, demanding the fastest horse in the stable and a hearty bowl of whatever's cooking. But it was a vital part of the system, transforming abstract imperial decrees into tangible, human interactions. The Mongol law code, often referred to as the Yasa or Jasak, laid out specific provisions for these public services and resource contributions, solidifying the legal framework for local supportive systems like the Yam. This wasn't just a request, it was a codified obligation, a mainstream historical fact underpinning the very structure of Mongol governance. So while it was a gentle burden, it was also a non-negotiable one. But here's where the subtle ways come in. It wasn't always a direct tax on your prize stallion. Sometimes the requirement might be for a certain amount of labor, villagers maintaining the roads leading to the stations, ensuring they were clear of debris and passable in all weather, or perhaps contributing to the construction and upkeep of the station buildings themselves. Imagine a community work day, but instead of fixing the town gazebo, you're building stables for Imperial Express riders. It fostered a quiet sense of collective ownership, a feeling that this yam, this lifeline, is our yam. What did these communities get in return for their efforts, beyond the satisfaction of knowing the emperor's urgent memos were zipping across the continent? Well, for one, the yam routes often served as secure pathways. Bandits, though a perennial problem in any vast empire, tended to think twice about ambushing riders on a route known to be under constant imperial scrutiny. Disrupting the yam was a surefire way to invite swift and disproportionate imperial wrath, a bit like trying to rob a post office during a federal audit. So locals along these routes benefited from a degree of security that other, less connected areas might not have enjoyed. Furthermore, the Yam stations often became more than just postal hubs. They were points of contact with the wider empire. Imperial officials, traveling envoys, or even curious merchants might use the Yam routes, stopping at these very stations. This meant that local communities gained access to news, goods, and even administrative assistance that might otherwise be unavailable. It's a quirky tidbit to consider. A Yam station, initially just a horse-swapping spot, could evolve into a mini administrative outpost, a place where local disputes might be heard by an imperial representative, or where news of distant markets and opportunities might quietly trickle down to the villagers. In a world without the internet or easy travel, the Yamchi and their stations were the closest thing to a daily newspaper and a community center rolled into one. The gentle burden aspect also stemmed from the often rotational nature of the contributions. It wasn't always the same family or village bearing the entire load. Resources were pooled, responsibilities shared. One month, your family might provide a horse. The next, it might be your neighbor's turn. This distributed the effort, preventing any single entity from being completely overwhelmed. It was a sophisticated system of resource management, proving that even in a seemingly brutal empire, there was a quiet understanding of sustainable community engagement. Historians still debate the precise level of coercion versus willing participation from local populations in maintaining the Yam. Was it a benevolent system of mutual benefit, or a cleverly disguised tax on time and resources, enforced by the implicit threat of imperial displeasure? While the Yasa mandated contributions, the practical application could vary wildly depending on the local governor, the specific community, and the prevailing circumstances. Sometimes it might have felt like a heavy burden, particularly in leaner times. Other times, the benefits of connectivity and security might have genuinely outweighed the costs, fostering a sense of shared purpose. Regardless of the exact balance, the sheer scale of the Yam's operation meant that millions of people, across diverse cultures and geographies, were quietly contributing to its upkeep. From the herdsmen of the Mongolian steppes to the farmers of China, from the artisans of Persia to the villagers of Eastern Europe, their efforts, big and small, were the unseen threads holding this colossal network together. It was a testament to the Mongols' pragmatic genius, understanding that true imperial reach wasn't just about military might, but about the subtle, sustained cooperation of the people beneath their vast, encompassing shadow. You've witnessed the tireless riders and the quiet stations, the lifeblood flowing through the empire's veins. But now let's truly marvel at how this silent circulatory system transformed the very nature of governance. Imagine, if you will, the great Khan seated in his grand capital, be it the nomadic elegance of Karakoram or the later, more settled grandeur of Kambalik. Without the Yam, his empire would be less a unified entity and more a collection of distant, loosely affiliated territories, each operating on its own delayed schedule. It would be like trying to conduct an orchestra where the musicians are spread across several continents, and the conductor's baton movements only reach them via extremely slow-motion telegram. Utter chaos, wouldn't you agree? But with the Yam, the impossible became, well, if not easy, then at least remarkably efficient. You see, the velocity of information was the true game-changer. Think of it this way. In an age where a message might otherwise take months, even a year, to traverse the empire's vast distances, the Yam compressed that timeline into mere days or weeks. This wasn't just a minor improvement, it was a revolution in administrative capability. Suddenly, reports of a brewing rebellion on the distant steppes of the Golden Horde could reach the capital while the embers were still glowing, not after the entire region had burst into a roaring inferno. News of a sudden drought in Persia, threatening grain supplies, could arrive in time for the central administration to consider diverting resources, rather than receiving the dire tidings months later when famine was already gnawing at the population. This newfound speed allowed for what we might call governance guided by velocity. The Khan and his inner council could make precise, timely decisions because they were operating with relatively current information. No longer were they blindly reacting to events that were already ancient history by the time they heard about them. Instead, they could issue directives, dispatch envoys, or coordinate military movements with an unprecedented level of responsiveness. You can almost hear the soft rustle of important dispatches arriving, perhaps sealed with the distinctive imperial falcon crest, being whisked directly to the Khan's tent or chambers. Each message, each report, was a fresh pulse of information, allowing the central nervous system of the empire to react with a nimbleness that defied its colossal size. Consider the military implications alone. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked is just how crucial the Yam was for the Mongols' unparalleled military coordination. When you're commanding armies spread across thousands of miles, from the plains of Hungary to the shores of Korea, the ability to rapidly transmit orders, receive intelligence on enemy positions, and coordinate multi-pronged attacks is not just helpful, it's absolutely essential. The Yam allowed for the swift deployment of troops, the redirection of supply lines, and the dissemination of tactical changes, ensuring that the Khan's will, however distant, was executed with surprising synchronicity. It meant that a general in the West, facing an unexpected enemy force, could send an urgent plea for reinforcements and receive a reply, or even the reinforcements themselves, in a fraction of the time it would have taken any previous empire. It was like having a very slow, but incredibly reliable, ancient internet connection for war. But it wasn't just about war. The Yam enabled the central government to gently guide its distant territories in myriad ways. Imagine the flow of information concerning tax revenues. Local administrators, knowing that their reports would reach the capital swiftly, and that discrepancies could be flagged just as quickly, were likely far more diligent in their collections and far less inclined to pocket imperial funds for too long. It created a subtle, yet pervasive, form of accountability. The Yam also facilitated the administration of justice. Reports of disputes, crimes, or appeals could be sent to the Khan's court, and rulings or investigators could be dispatched relatively quickly. This reinforced the idea that imperial justice, however distant, was still reachable and capable of intervention, preventing local power brokers from running entirely unchecked. And here's a quirky tidbit for you. Beyond the official dispatches, the Yam also likely carried a fascinating array of unofficial communications. While primarily for imperial business, it wasn't uncommon for officials, merchants, or even curious travelers to slip in a personal letter, a small package, or a request for a specific item from a distant land, hoping it would piggyback on the Imperial Express. Imagine a high-ranking official in China sending a letter to his cousin in Persia, asking about the latest fashion trends or a rare spice. Or perhaps a message from a lonely Yamchi to his family, carried by a colleague heading in the opposite direction. These small, illicit acts of personal connection, while not part of the official mandate, would have further woven the social fabric of the empire, creating an informal network of communication alongside the formal one. It was the ancient world's version of sending a postcard attached to an Amazon delivery drone. Not strictly allowed, but sometimes you just had to do it. This constant, relatively rapid flow of information meant that the vast Mongol Empire, despite its geographical spread, felt more cohesive. The Khan's decrees, his appointments of new governors, his responses to local petitions, all could be communicated with a speed that projected an image of omnipresent authority. It wasn't just about issuing commands. It was about fostering a sense of connection, a feeling that the center was aware of and responsive to the periphery. This allowed for a more nuanced approach to governance, moving beyond mere conquest and into the realm of administration. Instead of having to send an army every time there was a local disagreement, the Khan could send a well-informed directive, a compromise, or a stern warning, all delivered with the swiftness that made it relevant to the immediate situation. Historians still argue whether the Yam's primary purpose was ultimately more about military coordination or about facilitating centralized administrative control. Was it built first and foremost to move armies and war intelligence, or was its greater legacy in binding together the disparate parts of a truly gargantuan bureaucracy? Perhaps it was both, a testament to its versatility. What is undeniable, however, is that it provided the infrastructure for a level of centralized governance that was unprecedented for an empire of its size. You could almost hear the collective sigh of relief from the administrators in Karakoram, knowing that their carefully crafted policies wouldn't be obsolete by the time they reached their intended recipients. So, as you drift deeper into the quiet hum of the past, picture the Khan, not as a distant, unknowing ruler, but as a surprisingly well-informed leader, gently guiding his colossal empire with the invisible reins of swift communication. The thud of hooves on distant roads, the quiet exchanges at the Yam stations, these were the subtle, yet powerful, mechanisms that allowed a centralized government to truly reach and respond to its furthest-flung territories. It was the quiet miracle that held the world's largest contiguous empire together, not through constant shows of force, but through the elegant ballet of timely information. You've seen how the Yam hummed with official dispatches, a quiet nerve center for imperial governance. But now, let your mind drift to something far more vibrant, more fragrant, more sticky with the delightful residue of human interaction. Because while the swift horses carried crucial missives, they also, quite inadvertently, became the invisible threads weaving together the greatest economic superhighway the world had ever seen. Imagine, if you will, the Mongol Yam not just as an ancient FedEx, but as the world's first truly global Amazon Prime delivery network. Only instead of your new smart toaster, they were delivering entire cultures to your doorstep. And the best part? No assembly required. Before this astonishing network, traversing vast stretches of Eurasia was less a journey and more an extreme sport. You were gambling with bandits, hostile tribes, and the sheer, unadulterated emptiness of the steppes. It was like trying to get a package delivered across the Sahara Desert, blindfolded, with a target painted on your back. Not exactly conducive to burgeoning international trade, was it? You'd send out a caravan laden with precious silks, and you'd just hope. Hope that it arrived. Hope that you arrived. It was less a business venture, and more a very expensive prayer meeting on horseback. But then the Yam arrived, and with it something truly transformative: security. The very same imperial authority that demanded swift delivery of its decrees also ensured the roads were safe. Yamchi riders, with their distinctive badges, were a constant, visible presence. And where the Yamchi rode, patrols followed. Bandits, who previously considered the Silk Road their personal ATM, suddenly found their withdrawals met with very swift, very permanent consequences. It was like the Wild West suddenly getting a very stern, very efficient sheriff who also happened to run the National Postal Service. You could almost hear the collective sigh of relief from merchants from Xi'an to Baghdad. No more having to factor in a 30% bandit tax into your profit margins. What a concept! This newfound stability, often referred to as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, was a mainstream historical fact that fundamentally reshaped global commerce. It wasn't just about the absence of war, it was the presence of a reliable, predictable infrastructure. So, while the Yam horses weren't exactly hauling giant freight containers filled with tea and porcelain, the existence of the Yam routes meant that merchants could travel with far greater confidence. You could send your most trusted agents, your most valuable samples, your crucial letters of credit, knowing they would likely arrive. Imagine a merchant, perhaps from Venice, finally being able to send a detailed order for, say, a particularly exquisite batch of Chinese silk, with a reasonable expectation that the reply, and eventually the goods, would actually make it back to him. It transformed a gamble into a calculated risk, which, for a merchant, is practically a guarantee. These secure arteries became veins for a vibrant, diverse flow of goods. You could almost feel the texture of the silks, smooth and cool against your fingers, hear the clink of porcelain, delicate yet resilient, smell the pungent spices, cinnamon, cloves, pepper, wafting from dusty sacks. From the east came not just silk and porcelain, but also paper, printing techniques, gunpowder, the compass, and tea. Oh, the tea! Imagine the quiet murmur of conversations in different languages at a Yam station, as merchants from disparate lands exchanged not just goods, but also the subtle art of tea preparation. But it wasn't just physical commodities that traversed these newly safe pathways. Ideas, like whispers on the wind, traveled too. Religions spread with renewed vigor. Buddhist monks carried their scrolls and teachings westward, Christian missionaries, including those intrepid Nestorian Christians who had already established communities across Asia, found new routes to reach the far corners of the empire, and the tenets of Islam continued their gentle, persistent expansion. You might find a weary pilgrim sharing a cup of kumis with a curious merchant, each learning a little about the other's worldview, fostering a quiet, unexpected understanding. Technologies, too, experienced a boom in cross-cultural pollination. The Chinese invention of papermaking, for instance, which had slowly seeped westward, found its ultimate, accelerated journey across the Mongol Empire. Soon, paper mills were springing up in Persia, revolutionizing record-keeping and scholarship. Gunpowder, once a Chinese secret, became a world-changing force, its destructive potential ironically spread along routes initially designed for peaceable communication. Even the subtle art of medicine benefited. Chinese acupuncture and pulse diagnosis, alongside advanced Arabic medical texts, found receptive audiences far from their origins, leading to a quiet, cross-pollinating renaissance of medical knowledge. It was like the ancient world's version of open source software, but instead of code, it was, well, everything. And then there's the more quirky side of cultural exchange. Have you ever wondered how playing cards, those rectangular pieces of illustrated pasteboard we still shuffle today, made their way from China to Europe? While their exact journey is debated, the increased security and regularity of travel along the Yam-supported routes certainly provided a prime conduit. Imagine a weary Yamchi, waiting for fresh horses, being taught a new card game by a merchant from a distant land, then taking that game with him to the next station, sparking a tiny, quiet ripple of entertainment across the continent. Or consider the subtle shifts in cuisine. As ingredients traveled, so did recipes. Noodles, for example, a staple of Chinese cuisine, are thought to have found their way westward, perhaps even inspiring the pasta dishes we adore today. It's a delicious thought, isn't it? The yam, inadvertently, became a culinary highway, delivering not just messages, but the very ingredients of dinner. This remarkable flow of goods, people, and ideas led to undeniable economic prosperity within the Mongol Empire's vast domain. Cities along the yam routes blossomed, becoming bustling centers of trade and innovation. New markets opened up, creating demand for specialized crafts and goods. The empire itself benefited from the increased tax revenues generated by this thriving commerce, quietly funding its administration and further strengthening its hold. It was a virtuous cycle. The yam provided security, which led to trade, which led to prosperity, which in turn supported the continued maintenance and expansion of the yam. Historians still argue whether the primary driver of this economic boom was purely the yam's security, or if the sheer size and unified administration of the Mongol Empire naturally fostered such extensive interaction, with the yam merely being a highly efficient facilitator. Was it the chicken or the egg of imperial prosperity? It's a delightful question to ponder as you drift off. But regardless of the exact weighting, what is clear is that the yam, this unassuming postal network, served as the silent, secure backbone for a truly unprecedented era of global connection. It was the quiet hum beneath the bustling markets, the unseen thread that stitched together diverse peoples, fostering not just economic prosperity, but a surprising, gentle sense of shared humanity across an empire of unimaginable scale. It wasn't about conquest in this instance, it was about connection. Now, as you drift further into the quiet hum of history, let's reflect on something truly profound. How this seemingly utilitarian postal system, the yam, gently wove together an empire so vast it defied easy comprehension, knitting disparate cultures and geographies into a unified, if sometimes loosely defined, whole. Imagine, if you will, the sheer audacity of it. You're sitting in the heartland of the Mongol Empire, perhaps in Karakoram, and you want to send a decree, a simple instruction, or even a personal message to a general stationed thousands of miles away, beyond the Great Wall, or deep in the Persian steppes. Before the yam, such a feat would be a multi-month odyssey, fraught with peril, uncertainty, and the very real possibility of your message arriving not just late, but entirely irrelevant, like sending a text about yesterday's dinner plans to someone on Mars. But with the yam, those distances, those cultural chasms, began to quietly shrink. You see, it wasn't just about moving messages, it was about moving ideas. It was about ensuring that a tax decree issued in the capital resonated, however faintly, in the most remote pasture lands. It meant that the Khan's justice, or at least his word, could theoretically reach anyone, anywhere, at a speed that must have felt almost supernatural to the people of the 13th century. Think of it as the original global network, minus the cat videos and the endless scrolling. It was the world's first truly efficient intranet, connecting nodes across continents, ensuring that the vast administrative machinery of the Mongol Empire could actually function as a single unit, rather than a collection of loosely affiliated, perpetually confused provincial governors. Consider the psychological impact. For a farmer in the Golden Horde, or a craftsman in China, the knowledge that a Yamchi could arrive at any moment, bearing news or orders from the distant Khan, must have fostered a subtle but pervasive sense of being part of something larger. It wasn't always a comforting thought, mind you. Sometimes those messages brought demands for taxes or levies. But it was a connection nonetheless. You were part of the empire, not just your village. The rhythmic thud of hooves on the horizon, the dust cloud rising, the swift exchange at the Yam station. These weren't just logistical operations. They were tangible manifestations of imperial reach. It was like living in a world where suddenly your local postman could deliver a letter from the moon, and then you realize, Oh, I guess the moon is part of our delivery route now. This network facilitated the enforcement of a common legal code, the Yasa, across vast and diverse lands. While local customs were often tolerated, the Yam ensured that the core principles of Mongol law and order, particularly those concerning trade, tribute, and military service, could be disseminated and, more importantly, enforced. Imagine the challenge of standardizing anything across such an expanse without reliable communication. It would be like trying to organize a potluck dinner where half the guests are in different time zones and only communicate via carrier pigeon. The Yam provided the essential arteries for the empire's administrative blood flow, ensuring that even if the various limbs of the empire looked different and spoke different languages, they were still, in essence, connected to the same heart. This was a mainstream historical fact that the Yam's efficiency directly supported the centralized administration of the Mongol Empire, allowing it to govern disparate regions more effectively than almost any prior empire. Moreover, the Yam wasn't just a one-way street for imperial edicts. It was also a conduit for intelligence, for reports from the frontiers, for the whispers of discontent or the rumblings of rebellion. This constant flow of information allowed the central government to react, adapt, and maintain control, often preemptively. It transformed governing from a series of reactive local skirmishes into a more strategic, empire-wide endeavor. Think of it, a general on the western frontier could send word of an approaching enemy, and within days or weeks, a blink of an eye by 13th century standards, that intelligence could reach the Khan, who could then dispatch orders, reinforcements, or even diplomatic overtures. This rapid feedback loop was critical for maintaining the empire's stability and its astonishing longevity, preventing localized issues from spiraling into widespread chaos. Now, for a slightly quirky tidbit, to ensure the absolute integrity and speed of messages, especially critical ones, some Yamchi would carry special identification plaques, known as peza. These were often made of metal, bronze, silver, or even gold for the most important envoys, and were emblazoned with the imperial seal, granting the bearer the right to demand horses, food, and lodging at any Yam station, and often indicating the urgency of their mission. But here's the fun part. Some accounts suggest that extremely urgent messages were sometimes accompanied by a plume of black feathers attached to the dispatch, signifying death or extreme peril. Imagine being a Yamchi, riding hard, knowing that the very feathers fluttering from your message pouch screamed, "Do not delay." It's like having an urgent sticker on your email, but instead, it's a physical, slightly ominous, feathery warning. The Yam also facilitated a more subtle form of unification through cultural exchange. While its primary purpose was administrative and military, its existence created safe, reliable routes for merchants, scholars, and even curious travelers. As goods flowed, so too did ideas, technologies, and artistic styles. A merchant from Samarkand, traveling on a Yam-supported route, might encounter traders from Cathay, exchanging not just silks for spices, but also stories, beliefs, and artistic influences. This constant, albeit quiet, intermingling of peoples and cultures, facilitated by the Yam's secure arteries, slowly began to erode some of the sharp edges between distinct societies. It wasn't an active policy of cultural assimilation, but rather a passive, organic process, much like how different flavors in a slow-cooker stew eventually blend into a harmonious whole. Historians still argue whether the primary intent of the Yam was purely administrative control, or if it also served as a deliberate tool for cultural homogenization. Was the Khan thinking, yes, this postal system will make everyone feel more Mongol, or was it simply a practical necessity that had unforeseen unifying side effects? The truth, as always, is likely somewhere in the middle. It was undoubtedly a practical tool, but the profound interconnectedness it fostered couldn't help but lead to a certain degree of shared experience and understanding across the empire's vast tapestry of peoples. It's a debate that highlights the fascinating complexity of imperial governance. Sometimes the most profound impacts are the unintended consequences of pragmatic solutions. So, as you picture these swift riders, these tireless Yamchi, remember that they weren't just delivering letters. They were delivering the very sinews of empire, stitching together a patchwork of nations into a singular, albeit diverse, entity. They were the unsung heroes of globalization, long before the term was even conceived, quietly ensuring that the world's largest contiguous land empire held together, not just through conquest, but through connection. Their work wasn't always glamorous. It was often arduous, lonely, and repetitive. But it was the quiet, persistent rhythm of their hooves that resonated across continents, creating a unified sense of purpose and belonging, even if that belonging sometimes felt more like being part of a very large, slightly intimidating, but incredibly efficient delivery service. You drift deeper into the quiet hum of this ancient world, a world where the very concept of scale was redefined by the Mongol Empire. And as you do, you begin to truly appreciate the unsung logistical genius that underpinned this vast, sprawling entity. Imagine, for a moment, trying to deliver a single letter across a continent today without the internet, without planes, without even paved roads. Now multiply that challenge by 1,000, then by 1,000,000, and add the necessity of doing it every single day for an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. It's enough to make your modern-day delivery app look like a leisurely stroll to the mailbox. The Yam wasn't just a postal service, it was the empire's central nervous system, and its quiet efficiency was nothing short of miraculous. The true mastery lay not in grand, imposing structures or flashy technological marvels, but in its profound simplicity and remarkable adaptability. You see, the Mongols didn't need to invent the wheel, nor did they need to pave every single dusty track with cobblestones like some other empires you might recall. Their genius was in standardizing the process itself, a modular design that could be replicated across incredibly diverse terrains. Each Yam station, from the arid steppes to the forested mountains, operated on the same fundamental principles: fresh horses, provisions, and dedicated riders. It was like setting up a global franchise, but instead of selling coffee, they were selling speed and information. And trust me, in the 13th century, that was a far more valuable commodity. Picture yourself at one of these stations, a simple collection of yurts or sturdy buildings, perhaps a corral of horses, nestled beside a well-trodden path. This wasn't a bustling city hub, it was a quiet, functional outpost. Yet, each one was a vital node in an immense, interconnected web. The standardization meant that a rider arriving from the east knew exactly what to expect from a station hundreds of miles away in the west. This consistency, this predictability, was the bedrock of its speed. It meant no wasted time, no fumbling for directions, no wondering if you'd find a fresh mount. You just arrived, swapped horses, perhaps grabbed a quick bite, and were off again, the next leg of the journey already mapped out in the system's quiet rhythm. This distributed responsibility, where local communities played a crucial role in maintaining the stations and supplying resources, was another stroke of quiet genius. It wasn't just a top-down imperial decree, it was a vast, decentralized network where the burden, though sometimes heavy, was spread across countless hands. Historians still argue whether the imposition of supporting the Yam was always a gentle burden, or often a significant strain on local populations, especially in conquered territories. But regardless of the exact historical nuance, the fact remains that this shared effort made the system incredibly resilient. It leveraged existing local infrastructure and resources, rather than demanding the empire build everything from scratch, which would have been an insurmountable task. You could almost hear the collective sigh of relief from the imperial treasury. No need for a massive central procurement department? Excellent. The management of resources within this network was a logistical ballet performed without fanfare. Imagine coordinating thousands upon thousands of horses, ensuring they were healthy, well-fed, and ready for duty at any given moment across an empire larger than any before it. Think of the fodder, the water, the repairs to saddles and bridles, the rotation of riders. This wasn't just about throwing a horse at a problem, it was about sustainable animal husbandry on an industrial scale. And it was all done with a quiet efficiency that meant dispatches rarely faltered due to lack of resources. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked is that the Yam system was not just for messages. It was also crucial for moving imperial intelligence agents, tax collectors, and even light, rapid military units when needed. The intelligence gathered by Yamchi, the riders, on their journeys was invaluable for maintaining control and identifying potential unrest long before it became a crisis. And speaking of intelligence, the true product of this logistical marvel was information. Rapid, reliable information. In an era where news often traveled at the pace of a slow ox cart, the Yam allowed messages to hurtle across continents at speeds that would make your jaw drop. A message from Karakoram could reach a distant general in Persia in weeks, not months or years. This velocity of information was the quiet engine of imperial power. It allowed the great Khan to make timely decisions, to dispatch orders, to coordinate armies, and to maintain a grip on territories thousands of miles away. Without this unseen web, the empire would have fractured under its own immense weight, like a giant attempting to stand on stilts made of spaghetti. The Yam's uniqueness truly shines when you compare it to other great communication systems of the ancient world. The Romans built magnificent roads, primarily for marching legions and trade, and while they had a postal service, it paled in comparison to the sheer scale and speed of the Yam. The Mongols, on the other hand, prioritized communication above all else for their vast, decentralized empire. Their roads were often just well-trodden paths, but their system for traversing them was unparalleled. It was the original just-in-time delivery system, but for imperial governance. The unsung aspect of the Yam's genius is perhaps the most poignant. It didn't involve grand monuments like the Great Wall or epic sieges that filled history books with tales of heroism and destruction. It was the quiet hum of horses' hooves, the brief exchange of a message pouch, the silent dedication of a rider disappearing over the horizon. It was the administrative backbone, the logistical lubricant that allowed the Mongol war machine to function and the vast empire to cohere. Without it, the conquests might have happened, but the holding together would have been impossible. It was the subtle, pervasive power that made the empire not just a collection of conquered lands, but a unified political entity. A quirky tidbit that highlights this quiet efficiency is the use of pesa, the Mongol imperial passports. These were metal tablets, often gold or silver, inscribed with the imperial decree and granting the bearer the right to use the Yam stations for fresh horses, food, and lodging. A high-ranking official or envoy carrying a gold pesa could expect the fastest service and the best provisions available at any station. It was like a medieval VIP, all-access pass to the world's most efficient express delivery service. Imagine trying to explain that to a modern-day customs agent. Yes, I have my passport. It's a solid gold tablet the size of a dinner plate. And yes, I need the fastest horse you have immediately. This quiet logistical mastery was the true testament to the quiet efficiency that underpins genuine imperial power. It wasn't about brute force alone. It was about the subtle, intricate dance of organization, communication, and resource management. It allowed a centralized government to gently guide its distant territory. You've drifted gently through the vastness of the Yam, admiring its initial grandeur, its seemingly effortless flow across continents. It's like watching a perfectly choreographed ballet, where every dancer moves with impossible grace. But even the most elegant ballet has its moments of quiet, backstage chaos, where a dancer might trip over a shoelace, or a prop might mysteriously vanish. And so it was with the Yam. For all its initial brilliance, the sprawling, living network, stretching across deserts, mountains, and endless steppes, was bound to encounter, let's call them, minor atmospheric disturbances. Imagine, if you will, the sheer, delightful audacity of trying to maintain a uniform postal service from the frosty reaches of Siberia down to the sun-baked plains of Persia. It's a bit like trying to run a single, standardized coffee shop chain, where one branch is in the middle of an active volcano and another is on an iceberg. You just know there are going to be some adjustments needed. The challenges were as varied and vast as the empire itself. Nature, for one, was a persistent, if beautiful, antagonist. You might be picturing swift riders gliding serenely over sun-dappled plains, but sometimes those plains would be swallowed by a sudden, furious blizzard that left drifts higher than a horse's head. Or a monsoon would turn a perfectly good road into a squelching, impassable bog, forcing riders to detour for days. And then there were the rivers, sometimes raging torrents, sometimes dried-up trickles, always demanding respect. The Yamchi, those intrepid mail carriers, weren't just delivering letters. They were often engaged in a quiet, daily wrestling match with the planet itself. Then there were the logistical snags. While the idea of well-stocked stations was sound, reality often had other plans. A local harvest might fail, leaving a Yam station short on grain for the horses or even food for the riders. Bandits, though rare under the watchful eye of Mongol authority, were not entirely mythical creatures, and a well-placed ambush could disrupt a route. Or perhaps a particularly dedicated Yamchi, after galloping across 1,000 miles, finally arrives at the next station, only to find out they're out of his preferred brand of fermented mare's milk. The horror. It's these small, cumulative frictions that can grind even the most magnificent machine to a halt. But here's where the quiet genius of the Yam truly shone, its remarkable capacity for adaptation. It wasn't a rigid, unyielding decree carved in stone. It was a living, breathing entity that learned and evolved. Think of it as a vast, ancient organism, constantly sensing its environment and making tiny, incremental adjustments to survive and thrive. One of the most significant adaptations involved the stations themselves. While the general concept was uniform, a place for fresh horses and provisions, their design and operation quietly diversified based on local conditions. In the open steppes, you might find more temporary, mobile yurts serving as stations, easily packed up and moved if a water source dried up or pastures became sparse. In more settled agricultural regions, especially in the south, you'd see sturdy, permanent structures, perhaps even fortified, reflecting the greater population density and the need for more secure storage. This pragmatic flexibility meant the Yam wasn't trying to force a square peg into a round hole across every corner of the empire. It was finding the right shape for each unique terrain. The very horses, the silent engines of the Yam, underwent a quiet, continuous process of refinement. Mongols were master horsemen, and they understood that a horse bred for the open steppe might not be ideal for navigating rocky mountain passes or the swampy lowlands of China. So, at various stations, you'd find a quiet rotation of breeds and types: hardy, nimble ponies for the mountains, swift, enduring steeds for the plains, and perhaps even heavier, stronger horses for pulling supply carts over difficult terrain. This wasn't a grand, centralized breeding program. It was a practical, localized effort, born from the daily needs of the Yamchi and the wisdom of local horse masters. It's a quirky tidbit to consider. The Yam wasn't just about speed. It was about smart speed, tailored to the landscape. Logistical challenges, particularly those of provisioning, were met with equally quiet ingenuity. When a region faced scarcity, the Yam system would adapt, perhaps by shifting the burden of supply to a neighboring, more prosperous district, or by designating certain stations as primary depots from which others would be supplied. The Pesa system, those golden or silver tablets carried by imperial envoys, which served as a kind of medieval VIP pass, also played a crucial role here. A mainstream historical fact is that the Pesas not only granted access to Yam services, but also ensured that local communities provided necessary provisions and fresh horses, often under strict imperial decree. This wasn't always a smooth process. Sometimes local populations grumbled under the burden, but the system was designed to be flexible enough to negotiate these demands, perhaps offering tax breaks or other incentives for consistent cooperation. It was a delicate balance of imperial demand and local sustainability. Even the riders themselves underwent quiet adaptations. While the core skill of horsemanship was universal, specialized training might have emerged for those traversing particularly treacherous routes. Imagine a Yamchi who was not only a master rider but also a skilled tracker, able to navigate through featureless deserts using only the stars, or a resourceful problem solver who could repair a broken wheel in the middle of nowhere. The system fostered a culture of practical wisdom, where experience was valued, and lessons learned from one challenging journey were quietly disseminated to others. Security, too, adapted. While the Mongols' reputation was often enough to deter brigands, certain routes or stations might have been quietly reinforced with a small contingent of soldiers, or local garrisons might have been given specific instructions to patrol Yam routes more frequently. It was never about overt military displays. Rather, it was a subtle, almost invisible layer of protection that ensured the messages kept flowing. And how did these adaptations happen? It wasn't always through grand imperial edicts from Karakoram. Much of it was likely organic, bottom-up innovation. A station master might discover a more efficient way to rotate horses, or a Yamchi might find a faster, safer shortcut after a particularly nasty storm. These practical solutions would then be quietly adopted by others along the route, spreading through the network like a beneficial ripple. Historians still argue whether the majority of these adaptations were centrally planned directives from the Mongol court, or if they primarily emerged from the decentralized, practical wisdom of local administrators and the Yamchi on the ground. It's a fascinating question, hinting at the true nature of governance in such a vast, diverse empire. Was it top-down control, or a symphony of local problem-solving? Think of it like this: the Yam was a magnificent, ancient app, but it was constantly getting silent updates. Version 1.1 improved horse rotation. Version 1.2 added better winter shelters. Version 1.3 optimized river crossings. It was a continuous process of refinement, driven by the quiet, daily grind of keeping an empire connected. There was no grand Yam 2.0 launch event with fireworks and fanfare, just a steady, almost imperceptible evolution, making the system more robust, more resilient, and ultimately, even more astonishingly efficient. It's a testament to the fact that true power often lies not in brute force, but in quiet, persistent adaptability. It's why sometimes the most effective solution isn't the loudest one, but the one that just works, day in and day out, no matter what the weather or the terrain decides to throw at it. And so, as the Yam hummed along, a quiet marvel of logistical genius, it was only a matter of time before someone from a faraway land stumbled upon its vast, intricate web and had their mind, shall we say, gently blown. Imagine, if you will, the seasoned traveler, the Venetian merchant, Marco Polo, journeying across the immense breadth of the Mongol Empire. He had seen wonders, undoubtedly. He had probably navigated bustling markets, dodged camels, and perhaps even sampled some truly questionable street food. He thought he was prepared for anything, a man of the world, accustomed to the slow, arduous pace of communication and travel that defined his own continent. And then he encountered the Yam. It was like going from sending a message by carrier pigeon to suddenly having fiber-optic broadband. His jaw, one imagines, might have gently unhinged itself. He documents his astonishment in his famous book, The Travels of Marco Polo, a tome that, despite some scholarly debate about its absolute accuracy, offers an unparalleled glimpse into the Mongol world. He wasn't just impressed, he was utterly bewildered by the sheer scale and efficiency of it all. Picture him, resting at a caravanserai, perhaps nursing a cup of something warm, when a rider, a Yamchi, thunders past, a blur of motion and purpose. Then another, and another, all heading in different directions, yet all part of the same silent, powerful current. It must have felt like watching a perfectly choreographed ballet, but with horses and urgent messages instead of tutus and pirouettes. He probably thought, wait, is this real life? Or did I just consume too much fermented mare's milk? Marco Polo describes the Yam in detail, painting a vivid picture for his European audience who, let's be honest, were probably still struggling to get a letter from one city to the next without it getting lost or eaten by a goat. He speaks of the imperial post houses, or yams, spaced at regular intervals along all the great roads leading from the capital. These weren't just roadside inns, they were meticulously planned logistical hubs. He claimed that along some routes, these stations were positioned every 25 to 30 miles, though sometimes closer, depending on the terrain and the urgency of the route. This spacing was crucial, allowing riders to cover vast distances without exhausting a single horse, simply swapping out their mounts for fresh, rested ones at each station. It was the original relay race, but with imperial decrees instead of batons. And no, they didn't have little GPS trackers on the horses, but somehow they knew exactly where everything was. It's almost unsettlingly efficient. He was particularly struck by the sheer number of horses the great Khan maintained for this system. Polo estimated that at some stations, there were as many as 400 horses available, specifically for the use of the imperial messengers. Think about that for a moment. 400 horses, just waiting for their moment to sprint across the steppes. That's more horses than most small towns in medieval Europe possessed in total. It speaks volumes about the priority Kublai Khan placed on rapid communication. This wasn't a side project, it was foundational. He even mentions that in total, across the empire, there were more than 10,000 such stations, a number that, while possibly an exaggeration for dramatic effect, certainly underscores the system's monumental scale. Even if it was half that, it's still mind-boggling. It's like building the world's first superhighway, but instead of asphalt, it's just really, really fast horses. The speed with which messages could travel was, for Marco Polo, truly astonishing. He recounts how messengers, especially those carrying urgent dispatches, would wear a special belt with bells, announcing their arrival from a distance so that fresh horses could be readied instantly. These riders, often called Yamchi, would ride at breakneck speed, sometimes covering 200 to 250 miles in a single day. Imagine, that's like going from London to Paris or New York to Washington, D.C. in a day on horseback. In an era where a journey of 50 miles in a day was considered good going for a normal traveler, this was nothing short of miraculous. It allowed Kublai Khan, sitting in his grand capital of Khanbaliq, modern-day Beijing, to receive news and issue orders to the furthest reaches of his empire with a speed that was unparalleled in any other pre-modern civilization. It made his vast domain feel, for lack of a better term, a little bit smaller, a little bit more manageable. One particularly fascinating detail Polo shares is how the Yam wasn't just for official documents. It also served as a sort of imperial taxi service for high-ranking officials and envoys. They too could utilize the Yam stations, swapping out their tired horses for fresh ones, ensuring their journeys were as swift and comfortable as possible. This dual function meant that the system was constantly in use, a vibrant circulatory system for the empire's lifeblood, carrying not just messages but also people, ideas, and even sometimes curious foreign travelers like himself. It was a well-oiled machine, running on the power of hooves and human dedication. And probably a lot of oats. He noted the meticulous organization, the clear rules for who could use the system, and the severe penalties for misuse. This wasn't some free-for-all public transport, it was an imperial prerogative. Only those with the proper identification or imperial warrants could access its services. This strict control ensured its efficiency and prevented its overload. It was, in essence, a closed, high-speed network, protecting its precious bandwidth for the most critical communications. It was the ultimate VIP express lane, long before anyone conceived of such a thing. One mainstream historical fact that Marco Polo's account reinforces is the central role of communication in the effective administration of vast empires. The Mongols, despite their reputation for military might, understood that conquest was one thing, but governing was another. The Yam was their answer to the latter, allowing them to project power and maintain control over an area that spanned continents. It highlights that even in ancient times, information was power, and the speed of information could determine the fate of nations. A quirky or fringe tidbit that sometimes gets overlooked in discussions of the Yam is the incredible foresight involved in its very design, not just in terms of spacing stations, but in the standardization of the horses themselves. While not explicitly detailed by Polo, the consistent quality and training of the horses used for the Yam were paramount. These weren't just any old nags. They were bred and selected for endurance and speed. It's like having a uniform fleet of top-of-the-line sports cars, all ready to go at a moment's notice. It wasn't just about the network, it was about the quality of the nodes within it. Historians still argue whether Marco Polo's accounts of the Yam, particularly the staggering numbers of horses and stations, were entirely accurate or if they were embellished for a European audience eager for tales of the exotic and grand. Some scholars suggest his figures were inflated, perhaps based on what he heard rather than what he personally verified everywhere. However, even if his numbers were on the higher side, the core truth remains. The Mongol Yam was an incredibly sophisticated, efficient, and extensive postal system, unlike anything seen before or since in its era. It was a testament to logistical mastery that left a seasoned global traveler like Marco Polo utterly flabbergasted. He saw not just a system of communication, but the very sinews that held together an empire of unprecedented scale, quiet in its operation, yet profoundly powerful in its effect. And as he penned his observations, you can almost hear the quiet wonder in his voice, echoing across the centuries. You've journeyed with us across vast steppes and through bustling stations, tracing the invisible threads of the Yam. Now, as the sun begins its slow descent, casting long, fading shadows across the landscape, we arrive at the quiet twilight of this magnificent system. For even the grandest of human endeavors, like the most vibrant sunset, must eventually fade, leaving behind only the lingering colors and the gentle memory of their brilliance. The Yam, this surprisingly efficient postal system, was no exception. As the colossal Mongol Empire, once a singular, terrifyingly cohesive force, began to fracture into successor khanates, the Golden Horde, the Ilkhanate, the Chagatai Khanate, and the Yuan dynasty in China, the unifying force of the Yam, its very raison d'etre, began to wane. Imagine a vast, intricate spiderweb spun across an entire continent. As the spider, the central power, moves away or weakens, the threads, one by one, lose their tension. They don't snap dramatically, they simply sag, become less taut, less responsive. Local rulers, now more concerned with their own burgeoning kingdoms and their neighbors, often kept portions of the Yam running within their own domains, seeing its undeniable utility. But the seamless, continent-spanning network, where a message could fly from Beijing to Baghdad with almost clockwork precision, that grand vision began to fray at the edges. The sheer, monumental cost of maintaining such an infrastructure also played its part in this quiet dissolution. Providing thousands of fresh horses, feeding countless yamchi, ensuring the upkeep of hundreds of stations scattered across deserts, mountains, and plains. This was a logistical feat that required immense centralized wealth and unwavering commitment. When the coffers of the fractured khanates were increasingly drained by internal conflicts, rivalries, and the expenses of courtly life, the Yam, though vital, often found itself competing with more immediate, seemingly pressing needs. It's a bit like a modern-day government deciding whether to fund high-speed rail or another round of celebrity-endorsed space tourism. The practical, quiet infrastructure often gets overlooked when the flashier, more immediate demands come calling. Turns out, even empires get tired of paying the maintenance fees on their superhighway. The Ming dynasty, which eventually rose to overthrow the Mongol-led Yuan dynasty in China, largely dismantled the extensive Yam system as it had existed. They weren't necessarily against efficient communication, mind you, but their vision for governance was different. They favored a more centralized, less nomadic-influenced administration, and while they maintained some official postal routes, the grand, open, and almost universally accessible nature of the Mongol Yam was gradually curtailed. It was less about connecting everywhere with lightning speed, and more about connecting the capital to key administrative centers. The vast international superhighway was reduced to a series of more local, less ambitious country roads.